Chapter 1. Childhood and School Days. The name of Frederick William Faber, for all his brevity of years, is destined, we confidently think, to know an abiding place amongst the great ones who labored in the vineyard of the Lord. This we believe because his life was a spiritual odyssey packed with adventures, great strivings for truth, and apostolic achievements of prime importance. In early childhood, he found rare interest and joy in the things which pertain to God. As boyhood and early manhood claimed him, this preoccupation with things divine, leading him more and more to realize that he was not where the fullness of Christian truth abided, left him no peace till he had reached the church wherein rested the plenitude of revelation. And then, this goal attained, the cause of the Master he sought to advance, with a singleness of purpose, chivalrous ardor, and intensity of effort, which won for him the highest admiration from the most distinguished co-religionists of his day. Such indeed was his zeal for the extension of God's kingdom, that from the day of his conversion till the time when disease made him helpless, all his letters, hymns, poems, and spiritual books spoke of it in most arresting fashion. Yet for all the great and fascinating features of his character and achievements, the biographical tributes to Father Faber and his work are indeed very scanty. Furthermore, these few biographies, in our estimation, fall far short of doing justice to a man who was one of the most zealous and erudite priests of 19th century England. Hoping, therefore, to make good to some extent the defects of these life records, we now undertake to recount once more the attractive and very edifying story of this remarkable convert to the Church. Frederick William Faber was born on 28th of June 1814 at Calverley, Yorkshire. In his veins flowed French as well as English blood, for his father, Thomas Henry Faber, came of Huguenot stock, which sought on English soil the religious freedom denied it by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 by King Louis XIV. For the English element in his blood, he was indebted to Betty Atkinson, daughter of a certain Thomas Atkinson of Bradford, Yorkshire. With the place of his birth, however, he was to experience but a very brief association. In the following December, his father, a member of the Anglican Church, was appointed secretary to Dr. Barrington, Bishop of Durham. As a result of this appointment, the Faber family found it necessary to take up residence in the episcopal town of Bishop Auckland. There, the family resided till the death of Mr. Faber Sr. in 1833. As a child, Frederick manifested in marked fashion some of those traits of character which were to play a prominent role in the major achievements of his days of maturity. Whether he worked or played, he did so with an ardor, impulsiveness, and thoroughness which were quite impressive. Self-reliance, too, the first secret of success, as Emerson calls it, he possessed in a marked degree. And of this confidence in self he was vividly aware and even proud in admission. Nor was this the only phase of his character which his candor in crystal-clear fashion revealed. Such was his general tendency to proclaim his inmost self to others that even brief acquaintance with him usually led to intimate knowledge of his character. And this knowledge brought him many close boyhood friends, for his was a soul singularly joyful and sincere. With these moral qualities went a rare brightness of intellect and an impressive vividness of imagination, a combination which in itself gave promise of eminence in literary attainment, and which, when coupled with the strength of character which was his, foreshadowed in no uncertain way a leader of men with the advent of maturity. Of this promise his parents felt keenly confident. These moral and mental gifts, accordingly, they did their utmost to cultivate. His first acquaintance with education outside his home he made through a short course at the grammar school of Bishop Auckland. After that, he was sent for a more advanced course to a school conducted by Reverend John Gibson at Kirkby Stephen, Westmoreland. During those early school days, he evinced a flair for fine expression, which for one of his years was quite exceptional. And this was in evidence not merely in his schoolwork, but even in his conversation when he was confronted with situations which profoundly moved him. How telling his language could be on such occasions we find well illustrated by the following anecdote. Once he was caught by a farmer and his wife, whilst with some youthful companions, he trespassed on their property. As the farmer, in his anger, threatened to have recourse to extreme measures, Frederick, like a little man, undertook to plead for his party. This he did so well that the farmer's wife, fascinated by his language, interceded for him and his friends and obtained for them forgiveness. "Ye mun let them gan, master," she exclaimed in the dialect of her district. "The young gentleman has such a pratty tongue." The schoolroom, however, was not the only milieu in which Faber the boy garnered things delightful for the mind. His highly sensitive imagination found much to stimulate it in the scenic glories of Bishop Auckland, where the episcopal domain was intersected by the Gaunless, the brook celebrated by Sir Walter Scott in Harold the Dauntless, and where the neighboring rivers Wear and Tees came down from the mountainy confines of Cumberland and Westmoreland. He loved to wander and ponder on the things which beauty-haunted spots conveyed to his soul. Furthermore, whilst residing at Bishop Auckland, he often accompanied his father to Durham, where the bishop held court as Count Palatine with many of the insignia of royalty. The feudal splendor of this episcopal court provided his boyish fancy with the delights of a world rich in romantic wonders. More influences such as these came Ill's way, when later on school days began for him at Kirby Stephen, where he first became acquainted with the glorious scenery and romantic associations of the lake country. There, midst the beauties of mountain, lake, and forest, nature spoke to him so intimately that meditation on its many moods became for him a veritable passion. So profoundly indeed did those scenes affect him that many years afterwards he could assert that there still abided with him vivid memories of the poetic messages sent to him by nature those happy days. Hence we find him describing himself during those golden hours of schoolboy holidays as follows: "Thoughtful even then because of the excess of boyhood's rich abounding happiness, and sad whene'er St. Stephen's curfew bell warned me to leave the spots I love so well. Each hazel copse, each greenly tangled bower, is sacred to some well-remembered hour, some quiet hour when nature did its part, and worked her spell upon my boyish heart. Nor were these the only visions generated in the soul of the youthful Faber by the scenic beauties of this district. Such already was his interest in history, and such its fancy-kindling influence on him, that he loved to look on this beautiful, storied countryside with the eye of the romantic student of the past. To put it in his own vivid words, the forests were replanted, the chases were filled again with deer, the ancestors of the red deer of the Duke of Norfolk, which still drank at the brink of Ullswater by Lyulph's Tower. The heronries slanted again over the edges of the lakes. The unpersecuted eagles woke the echoes of Helvellyn. Spear-tops glanced in the sun on the steep paths that lay like pale green threads across the mountains. The castles rang with arms. The bright ivy had not mantled the ruddy sandstone beacons which warned men of the Scotch. The abbeys and chantries were haunted by church music, while the lesser cells in the secluded pastoral vales heard once more the nightly aspirations of wakeful prayer, and Cistercian shepherds could scarcely be distinguished in their white habits from the sheep they tended as they moved across the fells high up above their moorland granges. As the warder on the battlements, or rather as the alchemist from his turret, saw that land of hills and woods and waters beneath the starlight long ago, so did I see it always in those ardent years. From earliest times it was to me the land of nightly days, and the spell has never been broken. When it became the dwelling place of manhood and the scene of earnest labor, the light upon it only grew more golden. And now, a year-long prisoner in the great capital, that region seems to me a home whence I have been exiled, but which only to think of is tranquility and joy. From Kirkby Stephen he departed in 1825. After that he spent a short time at Shrewsbury School. From there he proceeded to Harrow, where he remained till entering Oxford in 1832. At Harrow, fortunately for his spiritual development, he had as headmaster Dr. Longley, afterwards Archbishop of Canterbury. To this man's wise and fatherly direction, he ever professed his profound indebtedness. And with good reason, for it was through Dr. Longley's gentle influence that he was rescued from infidel views which might have spelt disaster for his religious future. His stay at Harrow was also signalized by the intense interest he took in the study of English literature. So profoundly, indeed, did English letters appeal to him that his application to the study of the classics was far from sufficient for satisfactory progress therein. This pet study, too, so preoccupied him that he took but little interest in the major pastimes of the college. Sufficient time, however, he found for the attainment of proficiency in swimming and riding. While at Harrow, there came to him the first great sorrow of his life. That was the death of his mother in 1829. Her loss he very bitterly felt. For him, she had loved far more than any other member of the family. From Harrow, we follow him to Balliol College, Oxford, for his matriculation in 1832. Soon after this, during the ensuing winter, he was a candidate for a scholarship. Although this he failed to obtain, his examination was considered sufficiently satisfactory for admission to residence in 1833. The year which brought him the joy of residence in Oxford brought him also the second great sorrow of his young life, the death of a father who had watched with keen solicitude over his moral and intellectual development. Henceforth, his oldest brother, T.H. Faber of Stockton-on-Tees, became responsible for all his needs. Oxford knew him but a short while when his literary ability made itself strikingly felt in university circles. In the debating society of the university, he proved himself an eloquent and cogent speaker. To the writing of verse, too, he devoted considerable attention. For these poetic effusions, his exceptional powers of observation found much material in Oxford and its neighborhood. For this work, he also found considerable inspiration in the memories of scenes associated with his childhood. To these scenes, indeed, he was, poetically speaking, more intimately attached than to Oxford and its environment for these early days at the university. We find him writing of that attachment as follows. I literally live among the mountain scenes of my schoolboy days and breathe the liberal air and feel the mountain influences. His triumphs in these and other literary activities he owed perhaps as much to his studious ways as to his intellectual brilliance. A fellow student who knew him intimately during the whole of his undergraduate career has testified to the determination with which, despite severe suffering from frequent headaches, he formed those habits of study which paved the way to his future erudition. Vying with the esteem accorded his literary brilliance by intellectual circles were the social favors won for him through rare elegance of person and fine conversational gifts. To these endowments of body and mind, one of his contemporaries paid the following striking tribute. Our first recollection of F. Faber, he wrote, is of a graceful and intelligent boy just launched into a great public school, and next, as a young man who had lately won for himself a high place in honors at Oxford. No one could have known him in those days without being attracted by a grace of person and mind rarely to be met with. Amongst the many who treasured his friendship were such notable persons as Sir Roundell Palmer, Mr. Beresford Hope, Lord John Manners, and Dean Stanley. And this popularity we must consider all the more remarkable when we remember that a critical bent born of rare powers of penetration and characterized by much candor and a sense of the ludicrous was frequently revealed in his speech. For all these absorbing intellectual and social activities, Faber, from the very outset of his university career, succeeded in being very much in earnest about the affairs of his soul. To this moral seriousness, his efforts to cultivate an intimate sense of the presence of God especially bore testimony. For this devotional trend, he was considerably indebted to early parental training. Speaking of this early influence, his first biographer says, when he came into residence at Oxford, his Regius ideas had already assumed a very definite shape, for the spiritual training of his parents had indoctrinated him with the Calvinistic views which were traditional in his family, and these had been further strengthened by what had passed at Harrow. There was much in them to attract him, His ardent nature was pleased with the warmth of expression which they encouraged, whilst the personal intercourse between God and the soul, vjich, their theory of faith promoted, was well suited to one of his affectionate temperament. How deeply the truths of religion possessed his mind appears from his hymn, "The God of My Childhood," which expresses a continual sense of the presence and providence of God. It refers to the teaching of his mother, the sweet and wondrous things on which he loved to dwell, and gives evidence of her love of him in the verse, "They bade me call thee Father, Lord. Sweet was the freedom deemed, and yet more like a mother's ways. Thy quiet mercies seemed." This spiritual earnestness, too, he evinced by his regular attendance at the parochial services at St. Mary's Church, near Oxford, of which John Henry Newman was the vicar. These religious contacts with Newman soon begot in Faber a great admiration for the vicar, although he was not to be personally acquainted with him until 3 or 4 years later. In him, Faber, intellectually ambitious and strictly virtuous, believed he had found a worthy leader, one such as Principal Sherp has pictured for us in the following passage. The influence he had gained, without apparently setting himself to seek it, was something altogether unlike anything else in our time. A mysterious veneration had by degrees gathered round him, till now it was almost as though some Ambrose or Augustine of old had reappeared. What were the qualities which inspired these feelings? There was, of course, learning and refinement. There was genius, not indeed of a philosopher, but of a subtle and original thinker, an unequaled edge of dialectic, and these all glorified by the imagination of a poet. Then there was the utter unworldliness, the setting aside of all the things which men most prize, the tamelessness of soul which was ready to essay the impossible. Men felt that here was one of that small transfigured band which the world cannot tame. This reverence for Newman soon led Faber to take a profound interest in the religious movement of which the vicar was the leading personality, and which found its chief exposition in the series of tracts for the Times. This movement aimed at upholding primitive Christianity as extant in the English Church, whilst condemning the excesses of Rome on the one hand, and of Geneva and Wittenberg on the other. Of the interest which Faber took in its doctrinal questions we have abundant evidence in his correspondence of this period. Let us cite a few samples for the reader. In a letter dated January ist, we find the following. "Transubstantiation has been bothering me. Not that I lean to it, but I have seen no refutation of it. How can it be absurd and contradictory to the evidence of our senses, when they cannot by any means take cognizance of the unknown being, substance, which alone is held up as the subject of this conversion? Answer that." In another letter of the same year he wrote, "Ignatius I find to be quite as strong as the Most High Church could wish. Follow after your bishop, presbyters, and deacons, for without these there is no church." It becomes a very serious question now as to the obedience demanded from us to his epistles, confessedly corrupt, and about the text of which fresh disputes are daily arising. This sympathy of the youthful Faber for the religious orientation of his leader was destined, however, to be of brief duration. Despite the fact that Newman maintained that his methods could never lead to Rome, and even often assailed in violent fashion the living system which the papacy controlled and embodied, Faber, during his second year at the university, sensing the lengths to which the Tractarian movement with its exaltation of the powers of the priesthood and its insistence on apostolic succession would have to go, abandoned his leader and reverted to his Calvinistic tenets of religious pietism. For the history of this reaction, we give the reader some of the most telling extracts from his letters of this period. Writing to John Brandy Morris on September 10th, 1834, he said, "K brings a charge against Oxford which I fear we must both acknowledge to be in the general true. He says, T am less acquainted with the interior of Oxford, but Cambridge abounds with men whose ardent desire it is to glorify the Master who has loved them and given himself for them. The great evil which I seem to perceive at Oxford was the substitution of a sort of zeal for the exterior of religion for the inward spirit of faith and love. How easy it is to mistake the love of our party for the love of our God, to put the Church of England in the place of the Church of Christ, and to care infinitely more for the outworks than the doctrines she so zealously inculcates. Now, J, I will fairly plead guilty, as an Oxonian, to this charge. There is a great deal of this in our dear university. Not that it is wrong. These things ought we to do, but not to leave the other undone. I love the Church of England most fervently and affectionately, and with a love which grows warmer and warmer as I become more intimately acquainted with her doctrines and her ordinances. But I will confess that I suspect and mistrust that sort of religion in which apostolicity, establishment, episcopacy, etc., are terms in more frequent usage than depravity, atonement, justification, etc., in which the Church is defined to be a body corporate as opposed to dissent, and not a mystical union and incorporation of its members with Christ and with each other, as opposed to the carnal world. In a letter to the same friend dated September 28, 1834, we find the following revealing statements. When I first felt a Calvinistic bias growing upon me, stronger and stronger every day, it was the subject of most earnest prayer to God that He would guide me into all truth. I had been accustomed to have the most unreserved communication with my Oxford friends on all matters of religious opinion, and I shrunk from anything like concealment. I was perfectly aware of your extreme dislike to Calvinists, and as I knew you were a far better biblicalist than men of your standing usually are, and an infinitely better one than myself, I felt unwilling to provoke a paper discussion, feeling confident that neither party could clearly convey their impressions save viva voce. And it is on this account that I still decline paper controversy on this subject, not doubting that all things will be made clear when we meet. The present letter, then, will not touch the most remotely upon Arminian or Calvinistic or middle party opinions. It will only, I trust, place my conduct before you in a somewhat more pardonable light than that in which you now view it. Unwilling, as I said before, to have any concealment on this head, I could not help reflecting that if I entertained this bias in silence and did not mention it till we met at Oxford, and yet kept writing letters to you on religious topics, there would be an unpleasant appearance of hypocrisy, or, to say the least, of want of confidence and unfriendly reserve on my part. With this impression I wrote to H, and desired him to communicate to you, what? That I had become a Calvinist? That I entertained Calvinistic opinions? No. That I had got a bias towards some of their opinions. I went on to say that I considered the controversy one which demanded long and careful study. That I should not make up my mind on the subject for 3 or 4 years to come. I mentioned that I had with prayer read the New Testament through twice without notes, and that hence had sprung my bias. Now here, my dear Morris, is the grand misunderstanding. You recollect the irrational precipitation with which I rushed to a conclusion in political and literary matters. And you recollect also the pertinacious obstinacy with which I adhere to a conclusion once formed, and it was natural that you should imagine I had been doing the same in matters of religion. Now I took care to guard most earnestly against this idea in my letter to H. I said there, as I repeat here, that I met with several passages and the whole tenor of several epistles, which I should have said decidedly favored the Calvinistic tenets. But I recollected the great authorities against them. I bore in mind my own ignorance and incapability to decide, so I did violence to my judgment. I refused to give an intellectual assent because that intellect was too immature to form a correct opinion of the controversy. I appealed to commentators. For the most part, they were in favor of the Calvinistic interpretation, and where they were not so, they seemed at a loss to explain the passages in any unconstrained manner. The result of my inquiry is simply this, that I disavow all Arminianism and all Calvinism, but I have lost entirely the prejudice which I once had against the latter opinions. And I see most clearly that the Calvinism of Calvin is not connected in the most remote degree with fatalism, and cannot but be a spur to, instead of a dissuasive from, active and energetic action. To show the final phase of this revolt against Newmanism, we produce an extract from a letter to a friend dated January 1835. I have been thinking a great deal on the merits and tendency of Newmanism, and I have become more than ever convinced of its falsehood. There is in the human mind at all times a strong tendency to mysticism, and when you add to this natural propension the accidents of depth of thought, peculiar line of study, and a somewhat monastic seclusion, I do not wonder that Newman's mind has become deeply tinctured by that mystical allegorizing spirit of Origen and the school of Alexandria. I can answer from personal experience for the manner in which it captivates a mind which is in the least imaginative. But there is a cause beyond this. Newman felt himself thrown into complete opposition to Whately and that school which embodies the modern notions on religion, and thus was led to take up a more decisive position, to define and systematize floating ideas and theories, and proselytize with greater vehemence than he otherwise would have done. He who hung his dripping garments and votive tablet to the ocean, God had no doubt a keener sense of the perils of the sea than anyone else. And this, perhaps, leads me to regard with deep sorrow the spread of this amiable devotional mysticism in Oxford. It must inevitably, as it surely does legitimately, lead to that distinction between the religio-philosophy and the superstitio populi, which was the main earthly cause of the tremendous downfall of the huge fabric of paganism. No such consequences can of course ensue in Christianity, but a very serious blow may be given to the church by bodies of young men going out to be parish priests, believing that there are inner doctrines, which it is as well not to reveal to the vulgar mysteries. I am using Newman's own woe ards, which are his peculiar treasure. Thoughts which it is scarcely right to enlarge upon in a mixed congregation. Am I chimerical in anticipating quite as much danger from the mysticisms of Newman as from the rationalities of Whately? It is not in my case, as you well know, that he jests at scars who never felt a wound. I can most sincerely say that after having been an unprejudiced acolyte of Newman's, an attentive reader of his works, a diligent attender at his church, I found the impressive symphonies of the Bible irksome to me. All its quiet consolations were knocked away from under me, and vague, bodiless, platonic reveries were the food my soul craved for. Observe, Know that this is not the case with Newman himself. Believe him to be an eminently pious, humble-minded Christian. But I think that he has sat at the feet of the earthly contemplative philosophers with an unscriptural humility, that he has imbibed their notions, and that his followers are likely to become a sort of Christian Essenes. Of course, it would be preposterous in me to charge upon Newman what was probably in a great measure my own fault. But still I think I may argue that the tendency of his system is bad, and I look upon its onward course with fear and with distrust. Towards the end of 1834, Faber was elected Scholar of University College. There he took up residence early in 1835. At University College, his keen interest in the fine things of the spoken and written word knew no abatement. In the activities of the University Debating Society, he took a prominent and zestful part. Through his H-derary contributions to the Oxford University magazine, he played a major role in its establishment. His greatest intellectual effort, however, at this time, was called forth by his competition for the coveted Newdigate Prize poem. The subject prescribed for this poetic test was The Knights of St. John, a theme well calculated to move to noble utterance the romantic soul of Faber. The poem he produced revealed a rich imagery couched in an elegant diction which brought him easy victory over 37 other competitors. These literary triumphs begot an abounding happiness in the heart of the ambitious young student. In a letter to a friend soon after his latest success, he stated with characteristic candor that he now experienced a pleasure rooted in a sense of intellectual power which for him surpassed all other natural joys of life. And that was a pleasure destined to abide with Faber, even when he had attained to exceptional sanctity, for, towards the close of his life, in one of his masterpieces of devotional writing, he pays glowing tribute to intellectual activity as a fount of happiness. Can any pleasure, he writes, be more exquisite than the sensible exercise of our mental faculties? The variety, The multitude, the depth, the rapidity, the interweaving of our thoughts are full of boundless enjoyment, leading us through realms and realms of truth and beauty, and charming us at every turn with some enchanting discovery. This devotion to English letters, however, consumed so much of his time that his progress in the classics was still far from what it should have been. Nevertheless, by now his knowledge of the literature of Greece and Rome sufficed to develop in him a keen appreciation of its cultural worth. But this taste never culminated in profound scholarship because of the damper put on these studies by fear of their bad influence on his moral life and by a pronounced desire to find as much time as possible for the reading of religious books. By now, his personal charm and outstanding intellectual endowments had won for him a considerable following amongst his fellow students. The attitude he adopted towards this esteem of his associates shows that even now he was given to much self-scrutiny with a view to sanctifying his life. In this favor of his fellow students, he saw lurking dangers to his moral well-being. "I am but a boy of 21, he wrote. In what danger do I stand of becoming head of a party, of pride, of assumption, of self-sufficiency? And what injury would accrue to the cause of Christ from any inconsistency in my Christian walk?" How vividly this statement recalls the words of humble self-diffidence of another very remarkable youth, Frederick Ozanam, when confronted with a similar situation at the University of Paris. These evils, however, he saw a way of eliminating without rejecting the leadership preferred him. He decided to use the influence he possessed for the spiritual betterment of his admirers. He began to hold prayer meetings at which he succeeded in procuring the attendance of a goodly number of students. From the academic trumps of 1835, he passed, in the early part of 1836, to an important change in his religious orientation, which was ultimately to lead him to the victory of final peace in Rome. The bias for Calvinism, which made him, in 1834, reject the leadership of Newman's long and serious thinking, led him once again to abandon for a zealous advocacy of Anglican principles in the Newmanite movement. How thorough this change in his religious outlook was his religious correspondence, at this time emphatically reveals through its many favoring references to the prerogatives of the Church, the need of the sacraments, and similar doctrines. Yet, that the logical development of these doctrines would lead him to the Catholic Church he failed at this time to foresee. Indeed, he still strongly rejected the idea that he could ever accept the Roman claim. By now, this strenuous academic life and many religious anxieties began to tell on his far from robust constitution. Indeed, from now till the close of his life, there was to be many a conflict between a spirit hot on the trail of work and a body enfeebled by disease. On this occasion, to recuperate his strength, he felt compelled, on May 9th, to pay a short visit to the countryside in the north of England. By the following June, he felt sufficiently strong to return to Oxford. At the university, he arrived just in time for the thrilling experience of hearing his prize poem recited in the theater. Soon after this came his summer vacation. This, however, brought him little relaxation, as his approaching examination for his degree compelled him to devote much of his time to study. Then, to add still more to the unpleasantness of these holidays, there came to him a recurrence of ill health. As a result of this handicap, he obtained through the examination a place only in the second class. This brought bitter disappointment to a youth firmly believing that an academic career would provide the best sphere for his religious endeavors. This scholastic setback, however, he was able to convert into a moral triumph. Although at first tempted to think hard things about the Lord, he tells us in his correspondence that after a brief but sharp struggle, he succeeded in overcoming this temptation and seeing in his frustration a wholesome chastisement for intellectual pride and conceit. "My disappointment," he wrote, "was very, very bitter. For 3 days, ill in body as well as in mind, I had a grievous struggle. Many were the hard thoughts of my deaf Lord which were suggested to me. But by his help, I conquered, and the conflict ended in such a mortification of proud thoughts and vain opinions of myself that I was left in a calmness and evenness of spirit more refreshing to me than I can express. Before the year 1836 had passed into history, Faber was to experience another bitter academic disappointment. In a contest for a fellowship in his own college, he met defeat at the hands of Professor Donkin. This reverse severely searched his soul. For Oxford he loved intensely, and he felt still convinced that therein he would be best able to fulfill God's will. Again, however, he sought to extract from this disappointment spiritual profit by seeing in it the likelihood of divine information that it was not God's will that he should spend the rest of his life in Oxford. Furthermore, if the day should come when he would feel certain that such was the case, he was determined, no matter how trying it might be for human nature, to submit his will to that of the Lord. To get relief from the mental stress induced by this twofold failure, and to recruit his strength, he went, at the close of the year, with his brother, Reverend F.A. Faber, on a trip to Germany. During his stay abroad, he spent a few very pleasant weeks with some English friends at Mannheim. At Heidelberg, too, he passed an enjoyable day meeting some of its noted professors and musing on its storied achievements. By January 1837, he was back in the genial atmosphere of Oxford. Much improved health now permitted him to apply himself very seriously to study. For this, he was rewarded by election to a vacant fellowship at University College. This success filled him to overflowing with gratitude to God, a gratitude which revealed a remarkable humility and an ardent desire for the advancement of the cause of the Master. "My heart is so full," he wrote to a friend, Reverend J. Morris, soon after his election to the fellowship, "that I can only say with Bishop Taylor, 'What am I that the great God of men and angels should make a special decree in heaven for me and send out an angel of blessing, and instead of condemning and ruining me, as I miserably have deserved, distinguish me from many my equals and betters by this and many other special acts of grace and mercy. One seem as it were landed in a harbor, where I would be hemmed in on all sides by such means of grace as are not ordinarily to be found elsewhere. And God grant that my growth may be proportionable. Hitherto, I have been foolish and thoughtless and overindulgent. I have now but one wish, to employ my whole life in doing the little good to Christ and His Church, which my dear Master has rendered me capable of doing in my generation." This success, great though it was, could not keep his dynamic mind from seeking conquests in other fields of scholarship. He was soon the happy possessor of the Johnson Divinity Scholarship, open to all bachelors of arts. A little later there came from his pen an essay for the Chancellor's Prize on the classical taste and character compared with the romantic. This he did not succeed in winning, his early neglect of classical studies having, perhaps, much to do with his failure. Yet, still not tiring of academic contests, he was soon a competitor for the Ellerton Theologicale Prize on the mission of St. John the Baptist. Again, failure came his way. This last defeat seems likely to have been due to excessive mental fatigue induced by several exacting examinations within a brief space of time. Chapter 2. Preparation for and Early Days in the Anglican Ministry. In the course of the year 1836, Faber's trend towards the Anglican ministry took definite shape. This was mainly due to the fact that he had become a confirmed and devoted Anglican of the Newman type, fired with zeal for the dissemination of the movement begun at Oxford over the whole country and indoctrinating with Catholic principles the English Protestant establishment. For the work which should fit him for this mission, he believed that the time had arrived early in 1837. The fellowship then won, by eliminating his academic worries, had provided him with adequate leisure for preparing for orders. For the Anglican ministry, accordingly, he now began to work with characteristic vigor. Writing to a friend in April 1837, he stated that his days were so full of this preparatory work that he had scarcely time for letter writing. So extensive indeed were his labors that Ruskin, the author of the dictum, "It is only by labor that thought can be made healthy," would have dubbed him the ideal student. This work entailed a long list of reading material for the Bishop of Ripon. The heaviest phase of this study, however, was involved in the translation of the 7 books of St. Optatus on the schism of the Donatists for the compilers of the Library of the Fathers. Through his share in this work, it is of interest to note he was introduced to Newman, who more than any other man was destined in after years to influence his religious life. This task he received at his own special request, as he was most anxious to be intimately acquainted with the works of the early Christian writers. Drudging at one father for the purpose of accurate translation would, he was convinced, very effectively help to mold him into a patristic scholar. This, however, was not the sole avenue to scholarship which he saw opened up to him through a study of the Donatist schism. Through it he was brought face to face with so distinct and interesting a province of ecclesiastical history that he would allow himself to be beguiled into all the collateral reading which it suggested. From these work-laden days he got a welcome spell of relief through a long summer vacation. Much of that time he spent with a small reading party at Ambleside close to the head of Lake Windermere. Thus began for him a long association with those scenic glories which he loved so dearly. There, too, he started a long and valued friendship with the poet Wordsworth, for whose poetry he had developed an early admiration which did much to form his own poetical spirit. With the poet he took many a long ramble over the neighboring mountains. Ofttimes during these walks, as breaks occurred in the conversation, Faber experienced the thrill of hearing new poetic creations coming from the ups of Wordsworth as his spirit found inspiration in the surrounding landscape. As a result of these intimate soul contacts with Wordsworth, Faber became such an enthusiast for the verse of his friend that the latter felt compelled to admit that his admirer's sympathy for nature was more akin to his own than that of any other man known to himself. That Faber found such interest and delight in the nature poetry of Wordsworth seems mainly due to the fact that there lived in him a great psychological curiosity plus an exceptional love of moral beauty. Now, in the nature poetry of Wordsworth, he could study a psychological curiosity so pronounced that the poet seemed rather to be in search of truth than of poetry, and behind this scientific taste, a deeper motive, the desire for such an experience as will be profitable to both feelings and conduct. In the midst of these pleasant, restful days, Faber was called to the order of deaconship. This he received on August 6, 1837, in St. Wilfrid's Cathedral of Ripon from Dr. Longley, his former master at Harrow. Immediately after that, he returned to Ambleside for parochial work till the end of the vacation. A marked feature of these first ministerial days were the 2 sermons a week which he regularly preached. The end of the holidays saw him back in Oxford. There he passed the next 2 years at much the same type of clerical work as that of Ambleside. During that time he acquired a considerable reputation as a preacher. His reputation, too, was enhanced by the occasional publication of little tracts on church matters which had an extensive circulation. At the close of that 2-year period, he was ordained a priest of the Anglican Church on May 26, 1839, by Bishop Bagot at Oxford. This, by a remarkable coincidence, took place on the feast of St. Philip Neri, a feast which in days to come was to mean so much for him. During summer of the same year, he paid a short visit to Belgium and the Rhenish provinces. From this trip he returned with much adverse criticism for ecclesiastical artistic tastes and practices, and something like contempt for the intellectual position of the Catholic clergy of these countries. Although there seems to have been some justification for certain critical judgments, most of them found their origin in his Protestant prejudices and ignorance of the many drawbacks with which the Church of these countries had to contend. Indeed, biased judgments such as these hastily formed were still characteristic of his attitude towards the life and culture of the Catholic Church. The next noteworthy event in his life belongs to the summer of 1840. He then took up residence in the house of a Mr. Harrison at Ambleside, with a view to superintending the education of that gentleman's eldest son. As this was very light work for the dynamic Faber, he supplemented it by devoting much of his time to parochial activities. For his zealous energy, he found an apt field of operation in a parish sadly neglected because of the age and infirmity of its incumbent. Thanks to his ardor in the cause of the Master, a few months' labor here brought about a radical improvement in the lives of many individuals and caused the attendance at church to be more than doubled. For all these tutorial and parochial activities, Faber found time to produce some poetic reflections of the scenic loveliness around him. These he gave to the public in the autumn of 1840 under the title, The Cherwell Water Lily and Other Poems. This collection, although proclaimed by himself as juvenile exceedingly, but likely to float, got a reception from the public which far surpassed his own modest hopes. About this time, it is of interest to note, report had it that he was contemplating marriage in the near future. Although his letters of this period indicate that there was some foundation for the rumor, they clearly reveal that there was no prospect of such a happening in the near future. What these reports meant to him, a letter dated October 21, 1840, to Reverend J.B. Morris, clearly reveals. With regard to marriage, he said, as one does not like foolish reports to go about, I may as well say that I have no prospect of it, however remote, and neither have nor have had any engagement on the subject. There is but one person in the world whom I should wish to marry, the person alluded to in my poem called First Love. But I have not the least reason for supposing she is in love with me, and I am quite sure she knows nothing of my affection for her, and there are few things in the world less likely than my marrying her. But you know my views on this subject. You may remember our talk in Christchurch Meadow about living alone and moral as distinguished from physical continence. My present state is just this. I am not even in love as most people would count love, and I very seldom turn my thoughts that way. I honor the celibate so highly and regard it so eminently the fittest way of life for a priest that if Christ would graciously enable me to learn to live alone, I should prefer much, even with great self-denials, to live a virgin life and to die a virgin, as God has kept me so hitherto. But I am under no vow and distrust myself too much to make one. Secondly, I think my marrying more likely at some time or other than I used to think it, from the great unhappiness I had at Oxford and the difficulty I felt in pressing my life into that mold. My health suffered from it. I carried on the struggle with hope. I have now less hope, but I have by no means abandoned the contest. I hope to live a single life, but I shall not be surprised if I marry. For the busy days at Ambleside in 1840, he had to pay by a recurrence of ill health in 1841. This was sufficiently serious to compel him to relinquish all church activities. Later on, finding that cessation of work led to no improvement in his condition, he sought permission from Mr. Harrison for himself and his pupil to undertake a continental tour. This was readily granted. This favor brought him great happiness for, apart from health considerations, it saved him from the necessity of resigning his post and returning to Oxford, which, for all his affection for the university, he did not now wish to do. Furthermore, this tour promised him ample opportunities of studying Anglicanism in relation to continental Christianity. This desire to study continental Christianity reveals, for all his recent zealous work as an Anglican clergyman, a soul not completely satisfied with the church for which it labored. Chapter 3. First extensive continental tour. Faber left England for the continent on February 26, 1841. His first notable stop was at Paris. Thence he proceeded through the central provinces of France to Marseille on the Mediterranean coast. From this southern port he went by boat to Genoa. From there he traveled through Lombardy and Veneto till he arrived on April 13th at Trieste. From Trieste he found his way to Greece, where he spent the latter part of April and the early days of May. From this classic land he journeyed to Constantinople. In the beautiful city by the Bosphorus, he was detained by illness till June 2nd. During the weary days of this illness, one of his chief sources of solace was a volume of Wordsworth's poems, which he managed to procure in the Turkish capital. To this source of good cheer, he then paid this tribute in a letter to a friend: well or sick, cheerful or sad, I can almost always get happiness and quiet and good resolves out of the old poet, God bless him. On leaving Constantinople, he traveled through Bulgaria, followed the Danube to Hungary, and passed through the last-named country to Vienna. After a brief stay in the Austrian capital, he toured Styria, the Tyrol, and Bavaria. From Bavaria, he returned to Vienna, whence he went northwards through Bohemia and Saxony to Berlin. His departure from the German capital saw him traveling directly to England. Ambleside he reached towards the end of August. Although the recovery of his health was Faber's main reason for traveling, he could not resist the urge to give literary expression to many of the things which fascinated him in strange lands. Several memorials of this tour he consigned to poetic form. One of these poems, entitled The Styrian Lake, gave its name to a volume published in 1842. The more important written work, however, resulting from this journey was a book of prose entitled Sights and Thoughts in Foreign Churches and Among Foreign Peoples. This also appeared in 1842 and was dedicated to Wordsworth in affectionate remembrance of much personal kindness and many thoughtful conversations on the rights, prerogatives, and doctrines of the Holy Church. It was based on a minute journal which he kept of his travels. This work abounded in remarks and theories on religious matters, chiefly in the form of conversations with an imaginary personage of the Middle Ages called Stranger. The Stranger gives expression to Faber's Catholic feelings and tendencies against which he seems to contend. The work, which he intended to continue in a second volume, follows the journal only as far as the approach to Constantinople. Much of it showed the keen delight he took in the architectural beauty of churches he visited. The book is of special interest as revealing him more sympathetic towards things Catholic than he had been a few years previously after his Belgian visit. Now he is unable to conceal either his admiration for the outward manifestations of Catholicism, wherever he met with them, or his growing dissatisfaction with Anglicanism. No wonder that Henry Crabb Robinson, the diarist, who, as Wordsworth's guest at Rydal Mount during the winter of 1842-3, had much theological discussion with Faber, wrote of him as a flaming zealot for the new doctrines and a sad fanatic. Throughout this ex-work, there are fine descriptive passages of rare polish and dignity, in which a mind well stocked with classical and historic lore, and a vivid imagination restores to famous landscapes the picturesque life of days long past. Of the rich, romantic way he had of depicting storied scenes, we get a vivid idea from what he wrote about the Dardanelles. Here is part of it. Who would not be interested in the passage of the Dardanelles, the broad Hellespont of old Homer? The scenery, especially on the European side, is not particularly beautiful, but still there are fine views of woody Asia, and there are the cliffs of Europe, and the blue water, and the white-winged ships, and all the glorious history which crowds either shore. Just before entering the straits, we pass the island of Imbros on our left, with a mountain seen over it, which we were told was in the sacred Samothrace. The Sagayan promontory guards the Asiatic side of the entrance. It is now called Cape Janissary. The sea on the Asiatic shore then makes an inland crescent, whose other horn is the Rhaetean promontory. In this bay, the Greek ships were drawn up during the siege of Troy. The Trojan plain lies beyond, with Ida in the background. Some few bends further is the castle of Anatolia, and exactly opposite to it, on the Thracian side, is the castle of Rum-Lea. These were the batteries silenced by the English fleet in 1807. In the miserable village attached to the castle of Rumelia is the barrow of Hecuba, the ill-fated queen. Sestos and Abydos were not here, as used to be thought, but further down, and by no means opposite to each other. We kept close to the European side, and could not therefore make out the mouths of the two streams which must stand for the immortal rivers of Simois and Scamander. A little further north, on the Asiatic side, is the mouth of the brook Kara Ovasu. This was the famous and disastrous Aegospotamos, where Lysander ended the Peloponnesian War by his victory. The large bay into which the Hellespont swells when you get north of the castles ends in a long, low, flat point. And opposite to it, beyond the cliffs which mostly form the European shore, there is a flat projection of shingle. Here, it is said, and indeed it is almost the only possible place, Xerxes built his bridge of boats. It must have been a sight of fearful interest when the sun rose from eastern Asia upon Europe, still lying in the gray shadows, and the immense multitude, in that infinite variety of national costume so carefully depicted by the pleased Herodotus, worshipped the rising god of light, and the despot, and an amiable despot, too, did reverence after the Magian fashion. As through the distorting narrative of the Greek historian we may discern he did, to the divine character of the Hellespont. And then to the sound of oriental war music, the army began to defile across the unsteady bridge. In this place the strait is only 1 3/4 miles wide, and by the time the whole bridge was filled with men, it must have been one blaze of pennons, glittering arms, and gay costume, Asia pouring her wrath out upon the plains of Europe, Asia, already bright in sunshine, typifying her civilized arts and elegant luxury, Europe still gray in the struggling dawn, yet breaking her barbarian fetters fast away. I thought of thee, thou pale green Salamis. Faber resided at Ambleside for the remainder of 1841 and the greater part of 1842. That period reveals nothing unusual to chronicle save a summons to the sickbed of his brother, Reverend F. A. Faber, at Magdalen College, Oxford, in 1842. With his brother, he remained for 6 weeks acting the part of a devoted nurse. Chapter 4. Rectorate of Elton and Second. Important European journey. In the autumn of 1842, his college offered him the rectorate of Elton in Huntingdonshire. This at first he hesitated to accept, held back by the desire to devote a considerable portion of his time to poetic work. From this urge of his literary nature, he soon succeeded in liberating himself. After much thought and prayer, he decided to abandon his poetic plans for pastoral work, feeling that up to the present, he had, in this respect, been consulting his own willfulness by very sinfully permitting the man of letters to overlay the priest. That this decision meant for him a very testing sacrifice we can well believe when we remember that, in the opinion of Wordsworth, this entailed for him the forsacking of an enterprise sure to bring him national fame. Of this conviction, Wordsworth informed Faber on hearing from the latter the news of his resolve. "I do not say you are wrong," he wrote, "but England loses a poet." And that decision Faber made in no half-hearted fashion, but fully determined to give himself completely to work for souls. "Oh, pray for me," he wrote to a friend, "that buried in that village, I may endeavor to live an apostolical life in church, parsonage, and cottages. God being my helper, I solemnly promise to do so." That such wholehearted acceptance of a sacrificial calling brought him much happiness was not surprising. "I feel so happy and open," he wrote on this occasion to his friend Reverend J.B. Morris. "I know not why or how that I think I must be doing right. And oh, how slight a sacrifice after all will it be to part with this sweet mountain land and all my dear friends, for a man of such faults as mine. My books are gone and now my mountains go. God be praised." Before assuming his duties, he decided to pay another prolonged visit to the continent. As the past 3 years had seen him far more intent on learning from than on criticizing the Catholic Church, he wished by this journey to make an elaborate study of pastoral methods in Catholic countries, and especially in Rome, that thus he might learn to govern as efficiently as possible his parish at Elton. This decision shows that for all his soaring in the high reason of his fancies, he could be very practical and thorough when confronted with serious responsibilities. To facilitate his contacts with the ecclesiastical life of Rome, he obtained letters of introduction from Dr. Wiseman, coadjutor bishop of the Central District, to Cardinal Acton and Dr. Grant, both residents of the Eternal City. With Wiseman, he had become acquainted through the publication of his Sights and Thoughts in Foreign Lands. In that work, he had attacked Wiseman for saying that the services of Holy Week were dramatic. While so doing, he quoted Wiseman without acknowledging the citation, owing to printer's error, by quotation marks or otherwise. For this, he sent a letter of apology to the bishop, which led to more correspondence and ultimate friendship. On April 3, 1843, accompanied by a former pupil, he began his European tour. In the course of the week, he traveled to Rouen by way of Southampton and Havre. At Rouen, he was fired with admiration for the Gothic glories of the Cathedral of Saint-Ouen, which from a height seemed to him in poetic mood a magnificent work of stone dropped from heaven. Thence he proceeded leisurely across France till he made a detour to Bordeaux. In this city he spent Easter. His next stop was Marseille, which he reached towards the end of April. After a few days here, he went by Nice to Savona. At Savona, he was profoundly 38 moved by the epitaph on the tomb of the poet, Chiabrera, 9. Amico, io vivendo cercava conforto, nel Monte Parnasso. Tu meglio consigliato cercalo, nel Calvario. Why and how he was so affected, let Faber himself inform us. I have often alluded, he wrote to his brother, Reverend F. A. Faber, to the struggle in myself between the poet and the priest, on account of the absorbing character of such a pursuit as poetry and the exclusive character of such a calling as the priesthood. More than once I have desisted from composition, but in the end nature got the upper hand of holier resolutions. All this has been passing through my mind lately, and in the acme of another struggle, Chiabrera rises from the dead and preaches from his tomb in San Giacomo at Savona. I do not think I ever got such a sermon in my life, and remembering that I have hardly ever written a line directly in honor of our Lord, I have vowed a poetical work in honor of Calvary itself, and have begun it. It is a translation of some most sweet ascetical hymns to our blessed Lord on his passion and cross, arranged for prayer or devotional meditation. If I succeed in translating them simply, with such changes as I think will adapt them to English devotional uses, they will make a little book of about 150 pages, which I shall publish under the title of the Rosary of our Lord Jesus Christ, the name they bear in the book from which I take them. Of course I shall in the execution do them as well as I can, yet I shall always sacrifice poetical effect to simplicity of scriptural expression, or literal rendering of a line whose quaintness has devotional depth in it. From Savona he journeyed to Umbria via Genoa. In Umbria, his religious and poetic instincts found keen delight in contemplating the many sanctuaries and scats of Franciscan legends associated with the Apennines. By early May he reached Pisa. Here he found the cathedral, except the facade, poor, but the baptistery divine, and the cloisters glorious though inferior to Gloucester. Thus was he led to muse and muse, pacing about on the thick clover till all his senses were wrapped in a delicious dream of art and history. Then, quickly remembering his Savona resolution and the raison d'etre of his journey, he felt that against these poetic reveries he must struggle as effeminate, sensual, literary, not devotional, priestly, Catholic, Christian. He must travel in Italy not as a poet or a tourist or a pleasant dreamer, but as a pilgrim who regards it as a second Palestine, the holy land of the West. After this, he tells us how he succeeded in shaking off the poetic fit and seeing in the sacred edifice of the Leaning Tower things which symbolize the character of the church. As the flowers had brought home before me, and the beauty had brought art and history, so the character of the buildings, and especially the striking calmness of the locality, brought the church to mind. Unaffectedly aloof from the city, in a calm meadow, the great tower leaning like a telescope pointed towards Rome, the minster whence the chanting sounded faintly, the glorious baptistery, a temple, most unusual sight, raised to the sole honor of the sacrament of regeneration, the veritable earth of Palestine in the cloisters where the dead sleep. All seemed a world, to use a wrong word, of its own, apart from the other world, yet near. unlike, yet into which the other world must pass. It symbolized the character of the church. It illustrated history. From Pisa, he passed on to Siena, a city which also greatly fascinated him. Of it he said, "None of the Italian cities except Venice has ever struck me so much as Siena has done, and although I am suffering severely from a bilious attack, I have scarcely been free from headache since I left England, yet I have staggered about the streets in mingled pain and delight. I do not mean to say that I approve of any of the elaborate details of the cathedral, but the miraculous whole runs away with any critical objections, and I pace the nave and aisles for long and perfect ecstasy." A red and stormy sunset was making its way into the building through the narrow windows and playing with the alternate stripes of black and white marble in a marvelous manner, while in the gloomy side chapels the candles burnt like steady stars before the several altars. La Comunità, i.e. Hotel de Ville, is also a delicious building, and for fairy-like effect, I really prefer it to the Campanile of St. Mark's at Venice. Altogether, I am fascinated with Siena, and could write pages to you about it, were it not for the tremblement de système which my bilious attack is causing. I shall ever retain a grateful remembrance of the city of St. Catherine and St. Bernardine, and my favorite study of hagiography will be pursued at Elton with fresh zest after all these new topographical remembrances. A few days later found him at Viterbo. There, despite its extreme filth and squalor, he discovered that, to one at all versed in pontifical history, it is full of admonitus loci, and there is no department of modern history so romantic, so various, so illustrative of humanity as the history of the popes. Rome, the primary object of his Junery, he reached on May 9, 1843. Through Dr. Grant and Dr. Baggs, the rector of the English College, he was introduced to many of the city's clergy, with whom he had many amicable discussions on the Anglican situation. Although these talks failed to convince him of any fundamental weakness in his position, they greatly intensified his desire for Catholic unity. Through these clerical acquaintances, too, he was able to see much more of the various works of charity and of religion than falls to the lot of an ordinary visitor. With them he spent a portion of almost every day, either visiting the holier churches, convents famous for miracles, and the residence of the saints. All this forced him to admit that, although one may be disappointed with the details of Rome, it is quite impossible for any Christian to be disappointed in Rome. You walk through the streets. There stood the centurion's house, and beneath that church St. Luke wrote the Acts of the Apostles. There St. Ignatius shed his blood. From that pulpit St. Thomas of Aquino preached. In that room St. Francis slept. In that house St. Dominic first began his order. In that shabby basilica Pope Zosimus heard and judged Celestius, and condemned the Pelagian heresy. Beneath the tomb are the relics of St. Peter and St. Paul. In yonder church 5 famous councils were held. In those catacombs are the bones of the nameless martyrs known to God only. And so one might go on forever. During these trips, it is of interest to note, he acquired for the first time his devotion to St. Philip Neri, who was to be his spiritual father in days to come. This came about through a visit to the Chiesa Nuova. Of that visit he informs us in The Spirit and Genius of St. Philip, published in 1850, as follows. "How little did I," he wrote, "a protestant stranger in that room years ago, dream I should ever be of the saint's family, or that the Oratorian father who showed it to me should, in a few years, be appointed by the Pope the novice master of the English Oratorians. I remember how, when he kissed the glass of the case in which St. Philip's little bed is kept as a relic, he apologized to me, a Protestant, lest I should be scandalized with their relic worship then, but I can understand better now what he said about the love, the childlike love, wherewith St. Philip inspired his sons. How profoundly moved in general he was by the religious contacts he made in Rome, we can vividly realize from the following words written to his brother. I feel as if I should like to satisfy my feelings by walking barefoot and bareheaded in the streets, as one would do around the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem, so present does God seem in this mysterious city. On June 17th, he had a private audience with Pope Gregory XVI. Of this audience, he wrote to Reverend J.B. Morris as follows: "The Pope was perfectly alone without a courtier or prelate, standing in the middle of the library in a plain white cassock and a white silk skullcap. On entering, I knelt down, and again, when a few yards from him, and lastly before him. He held out his hand, but I kissed his foot. There seemed to be a mean puerility in refusing the customary homage. With Dr. Baggs for interpreter, we had a long conversation. He spoke of Dr. Pusey's suspension for defending the Catholic doctrine of the Eucharist with amazement and disgust. He said to me, 'You must not mislead yourself in wishing for unity, yet waiting for your church to move. Think of the salvation of your own soul.' I said I feared self-will and individual judging. He said, 'You are all individuals in the English Church, you have only external communion, and the accident of being all under the Queen. You know this. You know all doctrines are taught amongst you anyhow. You have good wishes. May God strengthen them. You must think for yourself and for your soul.' Then he laid his hands on my shoulders, and I immediately knelt down, upon which he laid them on my head and said, 'May the grace of God correspond to your good wishes and deliver you from the nets of Anglicanism and bring you to the true Holy Church.' I left him almost in tears, affected as much by the earnest, affectionate demeanor of the old man as by his blessing and his prayer. I shall remember St. Alban's Day in 1843 to my life's end." These words of the Pope so affected Faber that we are told he was on the point of making his submission to the Church. Twice he took up his hat to go to the English college for the purpose of abjuring his heresy, when some trifling circumstances intervened to keep him from implementing his resolution. Why trifling circumstances should prevent him from taking this step seems hard to understand if he was not urged thereto by impulse rather than conviction. After this audience came a visit to the shrine of St. Aloysius on his feast day, June 20th. Here he prayed most fervently. These prayers seem to have met with a striking response from heaven, for he said that he left the church with the vivid impression that within 3 years he must be a Catholic or lose his mind. And not only then, but subsequently, did the saint seem to tell him that he wanted him to be a Catholic, for, on the occasion of his reception into the church, he informed Dr. Grant that every recurring June 20th St. Aloysius kept knocking at his heart. From Rome he went to Naples, Sorrento, and Salerno, and then back to Naples. As a short but severe illness at Naples rendered travel by land impossible, he proceeded by sea to Leghorn. From there he traveled to Florence, where he prepared a course of lectures for the Eltonians on the sacred infancy and childhood of our Lord. Referring to this course, he said, "I shall attempt, of course, no great depth, but much is opening upon me, and anyhow I shall live, D.V., a happy fortnight in the dolcezza of the subject." It was St. Anthony of Padua's special devotion, as the Romans use that word. And surely to all of us who are trying to win back the honor due to the real presence, all subjects which touch the Lord's blessed humanity get a double sacredness in our eyes. Thence he traveled by quick stages till he reached Bern. Here it is of interest to record, he wrote a letter which stated that the only bond now binding him to the Church of England was the influence of men whose authority he respected. How sincere his respect for that authority was, we gather from the great dereliction of spirit its binding force entailed for him. "If I try to pray," he wrote, "if I kneel without words in acknowledgement of God's presence, if I try to love, if I meditate on the Passion, all is in the mist and in the dark. It comes to this: to stay is misery at present, and I dare not go away." After his arrival in Bern, there is nothing of import to relate about his travels till the month of October saw him back in Elton. Chapter 5. At work in Elton. On returning to England, he decided to put aside for a while the doubts which harassed him concerning his Anglican position, doubts which his Italian visit had very considerably strengthened. Fearful of acting from self-will, he believed it wiser to remain quiet for some time than to take any decisive step which might prove to be the child of impulse. Soon after his arrival, therefore, he was immersed in the business of seeking the salvation of souls. Now that he was equipped with knowledge of the best pastoral methods in vogue in the Catholic Church, he set out, as he informs us, in the spirit of St. Philip and St. Alphonsus, to reclaim souls from sinful ways. Paying far less attention than most Anglicans were wont to do to ceremonies and decorations, he relied mainly on fervent preaching of the need of confession and communion for the reformation of his flock. These pastoral methods at first met with considerable opposition since, to put it in his own words, he had tumbled into a sad parish where nearly 400 rabid dissenters had discovered him to be tainted, to say the least, with Puseyism. Furthermore, many of his parishioners had become the prey of intemperance and profligate ways. Soon, however, his sermons induced a considerable number of FPEUPL to accept his teaching. The most promising of these reformed sinners he fashioned into a kind of community for special devotional exercises. These met at the rectory every night at 12 o'clock, and there spent an hour at prayer, most of which was devoted to reciting portions of the Psalter. On the eves of great festivals, these devotions lasted for 3 or 4 hours. In addition to these prayers, he introduced the use of the discipline on Fridays, the eves of festivals, and every night in Lent. Yet, not content with all this, he persuaded some of this select community to visit the sick and perform other works of charity. Most remarkable zeal, this especially for a man so troubled by doubts about his religious position. As a result of these days so packed with parochial activities, he who loved so intensely intellectual work had very little leisure for such. Nevertheless, during his few years at Elton, he succeeded in giving to the public the lives of several English saints, a revision of Sir Lancelot, a poem in 10 books, and a collection of several minor pieces. The proceeds of these works he applied to the repairs of his church. To help still more the work of moral betterment in the parish, he sought to remove sources of temptation from the people by procuring for them social distractions of an innocent type. Prominent amongst the amusements introduced were Sunday cricket and football, which, although drawing upon him severe criticism from rigid Protestants, soon became very popular. Of the other social devices to which he had recourse for keeping the people from sinful pleasures, and of the success which attended them, Reverend A.P. Stanley gives us a fascinating picture. It seems, he said, that Faber had devoted himself solely to the parish, and with the great energy of his character and fascination of his manners, had produced an effect on the people which I should think was really very extraordinary. He had lived on terms of great familiarity with them, having the young men, etc., constantly to dine with him, and read with him in his own drawing room, and having pulled down all the divisions in the rectory grounds, so as to turn it into a kind of park, and throw it open to the whole parish to walk in, so that on Sunday evenings there used to be promenades of 100 or 300 people, the poorer classes, and he walking about from group to group and talking to them. And thus, whilst the old people liked him for his kindness, there had grown up a young Elton, which quite adored him, and most of which have gone over with him. So profoundly, indeed, did he thus capture the affection of the people that when, after his departure from the rectory, his effects were sold, several insignificant articles were purchased for many times their value because of the manner in which his parishioners vied with each other for the possession of objects rendered precious in their eyes by once being his. Faber, the earnest laborer for the salvation of souls, was equally earnest working for his own sanctification. He was keenly aware that his success as a parish rector very largely depended on his own personal closeness to God. Such, indeed, were his efforts to sanctify himself that even these Anglican days he seemed to be experiencing that urge to high holiness of which the following excerpt from one of his books in his Catholic days speaks. The first thing which strikes us about the saints is the extraordinary fewness of them. If we love God really and truly, surely this consideration cannot be otherwise than a painful one. And yet it seems so easy to be a saint. Graces are so overwhelmingly abundant and God himself so unspeakably attractive that it appears harder to be ungenerous with him than to be generous. And where perfection is made to consist simply in the fervor and the purity of our love, there is almost an intellectual difficulty in comprehending why it is that the saints be so few. To sanctify himself, he became a man of frequent prayer, both vocal and mental. For the latter, he followed the system of St. Ignatius of Loyola. So earnestly, indeed, did he set about thus cultivating union with God, that even then he seemed to know a spirit like unto that which many years later made him write. The wonder is how, prayer being what it is, those who really believe can ever leave off praying, can ever do anything else but pray. Further nourishment for his soul he sought in considerable devotional reading. For this purpose he had a special recourse to Religious Perfection by Rodriguez. With the spiritual wisdom of St. Philip Neri, St. Francis de Sales, and St. Alphonsus, he was also quite familiar. Then, that the body might be well disposed to obey a spirit so anxious to be close to the Lord, he had recourse to very severe mortifications of the flesh. These austerities, however, for lack of proper spiritual guidance, seem to have gone beyond what prudence should dictate, for to them his medical attendant ascribed many of his attacks of illness. Around his waist he habitually wore a horsehair cord knotted. Often for his dinner he had only a herring and a few potatoes. During Lent, to such an extent did he carry out these austerities that sometimes he fainted whilst reading morning prayers. And to make these sufferings all the more sanctifying, he did his best to conceal them. Thus did he give striking practical expression to the dictum of his Catholic years. Silence is the best atmosphere of the cross, and secrecy its native climate. Yet for all this harsh treatment of the flesh, he considered himself effeminately inclined. Not content with these mortifications of the flesh, he added those of the intellect. This man, for whom the cultural atmosphere of Oxford meant so much, found himself, for the sake of souls, living the life of a village almost completely divorced from literary contacts. How keenly his intellectual nature felt this privation, let the reader judge from his own words. Writing to Reverend J.B. Morris, he said, "You see, I have no educated nor religious person near me. My solitude is, in effect, as utter as that of the Thebaid, the horror without the honors of an anchoret. It does not sound well for a priest to say that the poor are not company enough for him. Still, I do feel a want of those entretiens de recreation which even monks have." All this he tried to endure patiently, that the delights of the mind might hamper as little as possible his pastoral activities. Where such a pastor worked, we are not surprised to learn of very remarkable changes for the better within a brief period. In the course of a year, he had succeeded in getting even the most disorderly individuals to abandon their vicious ways and attend devotions. Indeed, so radically had his efforts transformed this one-time hardened village that no one had escaped his bettering influence save, as he humorously puts it, the parson, the pew opener, and 2 drunken men. Yet, for all these absorbing parochial activities and strenuous efforts to sanctify himself, Faber could never completely shake off torturing doubts about his position in the Church of England. How grave was the anguish caused him by these uncertainties we can see from what in later days he wrote about them. "There was many and many an hour," he said, "of bitter and earnest prayer, as to whether I should become a Catholic, many a kissing of the feet of the crucifix, and imploring Jesus to let me stay in the English Church, if it could be his will, and many a heartfelt prayer that I might not draw back when his will should be made known." Whilst battling with these doubts, he tended ever more closely to the Catholic Church. How pronounced that trend became by 1844, we may gauge from the following excerpt from a letter written to Newman. "I seem to grow more Roman daily, and almost to write from out the bosom of the Roman Church, instead of from where I am. I suppose I am not going on as I ought to do, for our system seems more and more to enervate me, and I sometimes get a glimpse of a state of mind which would view my position as a parish priest as that of a man telling a lie to people. I have written to you to ask you to remove your prohibition against invocating our Blessed Lady, the angels and the saints, but I have destroyed the letters in what I fancied were better moods, and in truth, I want restraints to keep me where I am. As a result of that trend, and the incongruity of being obedient to his Anglican leader, Newman, whilst being devoted to so many of the doctrines and practices of Rome we find him, before 1844 had vanished, crying out for a confessor who would help to solve his problems. When writing to an Oxford friend for a curate, he said, "The rector wants a confessor quite as sorely as the parish a curate." By now, indeed, he had come to regard sacramental confession not only as the best way out of his perplexities, but as the only sure foundation of saintly living. "The longer I live," he then wrote, "and the more experience I have in the conduct of souls, the more deeply I am convinced that in those days it is almost the only safeguard against self-delusion. Bodily austerities are not to be compared with it as a means of sanctification." To these worries were added others in the beginning of 1845. There were violent attacks on his Lives of the English Saints, published by Tuvey. The life of St. Stephen Harding had been considered by very prominent men, according to Newman in his Apologia, to be such as was inconsistent for an Anglican publisher to give to the public. This resentment reached its acme when The Life of St. Wilfrid appeared. This was assailed for the manner in which it revealed the marked development of the Catholic tendencies of the Tractarian school. In this work, passages such as the following constituted him a real papist in the eyes of the ordinary Protestant, whilst the vast majority of the most advanced Tractarians found him hard to swallow. He, Wilfrid, saw that the one thing to do was to go to Rome and learn under the shadow of St. Peter's chair the more perfect way. To look Romeward is a Catholic instinct seemingly implanted in us for the safety of the faith, Peter 4. Certainly it is true that he, Wilfrid, materially aided the blessed work of riveting more tightly the happy chains which held England to St. Peter's chair, chains never snapped, as sad experience tells us, without the loss of many precious Christian things. Wilfrid did betray, to use modem language, the liberty of the national church. That is, translated into Catholic phraseology, he rescued England, even in the 7th century, from the wretched and debasing formality of nationalism. pp. 84-5. Never was there upon earth a tribunal so august as that of Rome. While in the local church's party spirit and factious tumult, the wrath of kings and the strife of prelates keep all things in effervescence, the patient discernment, the devout tranquility of deliberation, the unimpassioned disentanglement of truth from falsehood, the kindly suspense, the saintly moderation without respect of persons, the clear-voiced utterance of the decree at last. How wonderful were all these things in the court of Rome! With profoundest reverence be it spoken, did not this tribunal faintly shadow forth the imperturbed peace, long-suffering, merciful delay, yet loving promptitude of the divine judgments? Earth trembled and was still. For many a century was this true of Rome. Surely it was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. 172, 173. By these attacks, Faber's sensitive soul was much pained. As a result, he decided for the time being to confine himself strictly to parochial work. His reasons for this decision he confided in the following letter to Reverend J.B. Morris. "I am quite sure, though I do not see how, that there is some sin in the matter, when you, Marriott, and Pusey all speak so strongly. But Newman's admission that he read the whole and passed it through the press and did not feel the objection so strongly as to speak, and Oakley's letter to acknowledge the good he got from it, must be consolations to me. It is quite clear to me that I must retire from the Lives, and for a season from all writing. The whole business brings home to me very forcibly the culpable forwardness and presumption of my venturing at all to take an active part in a movement, the very avowed spirit of which is to unsettle men's minds, is, has been, and will be." I ought never to have stepped out in the way that I have done. I feel this more particularly because in the case of St. Wilfrid, I have done no more nor half so much to Romanize men's minds and unsettle them, as others have done unblamed, and I think it is simple and most justifiable want of fiducia in the individual that makes his colleagues willing to throw him overboard when the cry comes, for outcries are periodical and have little intrinsic connection with the thing cried out at. This makes me think the admonition more providential. I have long felt called to a much stricter and more contemplative life than I have hitherto led, and severer penance, and it does seem God's will I should keep to my obscure duties and great retirement here. The weight of this trouble God, to some extent, lightened for him by a letter of encouragement from a very unexpected source. That came from Dr. Waring, Vicar Apostolic of the Eastern District. His reply to it revealed that he was near that light in which he would clearly see what God wanted him to do. "Your Lordship," he wrote, "will of course understand what sort of difficulties are forced upon anyone when he confronts, even in thought, a change of religion. But I may be allowed to say that I shall much cherish the thought that your Lordship prays for me, and perhaps sometimes remembers me at the blessed sacrifice. God grant that self-will may not accelerate, nor self-interest retard, any change he may beckon me to. I am far too great a sinner to be plainly told his will, yet I trust your Lordship will acknowledge that even in my position, I am within the reach of grace enough to find the right way, if I do not from self-seeking hold back when light is given." His worries grew apace with the arrival of the spring of 1845. As a result of these anxieties, very busy days, and severe bodily penance, his health deteriorated. This depletion of strength compelled him during the following summer to seek a rest and a change of air. To the worst of these anxieties, his religious ones, he was soon, however, to bid a final farewell. In the autumn of 1845, he witnessed the reception of many of his friends into the church. Amongst these was Newman, whose influence, more than any other consideration, had delayed his submission to Rome. In these happenings he saw the hand of God pointing clearly the way towards truth, although a high authority in the established church had spoken of Elton as a model parish where the system of that church was fully carried out. This directing hand he decided to obey. We find him, accordingly, on October 27, 1845, consulting Bishop Waring on several points connected with reception into the church. He also informed his relations and some friends of the momentous decision he had made. He hesitated, however, to do so immediately for two reasons. He felt keenly the leaving of his flock which he so dearly loved, and which he had led to so many ways of goodness, till it had found another zealous rector. The second obstacle was the state of his pecuniary affairs. On obtaining his rectorate, he had borrowed some money from relatives for the purpose of repairing his house and improving the glebe lands. Now he knew that immediate submission to Rome would mean his inability to pay either the principal or the interest of this debt. Indeed, such a happening would have left him nothing in the world save what the sale of his furniture brought him. Believing that if he consulted a Catholic about his difficulty, he would be advised to take immediate steps to enter the church, he put his case before an Anglican dignitary of his own party. From his consultee he received these encouraging words: "Depend upon it, if God means you to be a Catholic, he will not let that stand in the way." This dignitary's words proved to be strikingly prophetic, for, a little while after their pronouncement, God provided a solution for his financial dilemma. A friend who had heard of his perplexity wrote to him enclosing a check for the amount required. This help seemed all the more astonishing and providential in view of the fact that the assisting friend not only had no leaning towards Catholicism, but usua li was bitterly disposed towards those so inclined. This assistance told Faber that he must not let any consideration even briefly stand between himself and the way of salvation in the Catholic Church. After this, accordingly, he forthwith began to prepare for his departure from Elton. Then, his preparation completed, he had interviews with Pusey at London, Wiseman at Oscott, and Newman at Littlemore. Directly after the last of these visits, he decided to make his abjuration to Bishop Waring at Northampton. On November 16, 1845, he officiated for the last time as rector of Elton. At the evening service, after a few preliminary remarks, he informed his people that the doctrines he had taught them were true, but not those of the Church of England. Therefore, he said, departure from her communion was for him a necessity. That done, he came down from the pulpit, dramatically threw his surplice on the ground, and hastily betook himself through the vestry to the rectory. To the rectory, some of his astonished and sorrow-stricken parishioners followed him and begged him to reconsider his decision. They told him that if he stayed with them, such was their love and veneration for his personality, sanctity, and zeal, that they would not object to anything he preached. But they found him immovable and had to bid him a sorrowful farewell. The sorrow which pierced the hearts of his parishioners caused a sorrow of great intensity in the heart of the man whom conscience forced to abandon them. So much was he worn by anxiety and illness, wrote his biographer Father Bowden, and so keenly did he feel the separation from his place and people that he feared to fail in the accomplishment of the sacrifice, and extorted a promise from those about him that they would take him, if necessary by force, on the following morning to be received. That sorrow, however, the ascetic Faber was determined to use for his spiritual betterment. To this determination, a prayer scribbled that day on a piece of paper bore testimony. "O my dear Jesus," he wrote, "accept this intense misery for my sins and bless my dear mourning people." Thus we see that even then Faber firmly believed that sorrow is the making of saints, the very process of the transmutation of drossy earth into purest heaven. Chapter 6. Early days at Birmingham. Early next day, Faber left Elton. He was accompanied by T.F. Knox, a Cambridge undergraduate, his 2 servants, and a lay helper. 4 others followed him later in the day. To lessen the poignancy of departure, the party had hoped to escape notice, wrote Father Bowden, by starting early, but the parishioners were on the lookout, and as they drove through the village, every window was thrown open, and the poor people waved their handkerchiefs and sobbed out, "God bless you, Mr. Faber, wherever you may go." Their feeling will be understood by those who in later years felt the fascination of that sweet manner and musical voice with which his sympathizing and loving heart attached so many to their father. For the sorrow of parting, Faber and his companions were well compensated that same evening by their admission to the true fold of Christ. On the following morning, they received their first Holy Communion and were confirmed. At confirmation, Faber took the name of Wilfrid. With reception into the church, there came to Faber that perfect peace which he had long found so elusive. 2 days after that event, he wrote to Reverend J.B. Morris, "Every hour now seems to dispel doubts, and so to augment inward peace, that I cannot but yearn that those I love should enjoy the same privileges with myself. A new light seems to be shed on everything, and more especially on my past position. A light so clear as to surprise me, and though I am homeless and unsettled, and as to worldly prospects considerably bewildered, yet there is such a repose of conscience as more than compensates for the intense and fiery struggle which began on the Tuesday, and only ended on the Monday morning following. Now that he knew a content he had never known before, Faber became fired with an ardor for the service of God, surpassing any apostolic zeal which had ever before possessed him. This led him immediately to set about considering how most efficiently he could start serving the church of his new loyalty. He soon decided that the most favorable place for such a beginning was Birmingham. In making this decision, he was actuated by the following motives. He had been invited to a shelter in the parish of St. Chad's of that city till he could settle his affairs and make satisfactory arrangements for his future. In that parish, owing to the zeal of its pastor, Father Moore, he could study the operations of an important center of Catholic life. Furthermore, in its environment, he would FMD a congenial atmosphere because of the many recent converts settled therein. And finally, the presence there of his friend, Dr. Wiseman, as coadjutor to the bishop of the Central District, was for him a great attraction. On his arrival there, Dr. Waring offered to raise him immediately to the priesthood. This favor his humility forbade him to accept. His early days at Birmingham found Faber very busy trying to bring others to the light he now enjoyed. Indeed, he already evinced a zest for the conquest of heresy, vividly suggestive of that revealed by the following extract from his writings many years later. Many a convert in whose soul God would have done grand things goes to his grave a spiritual failure because he would not hate heresy. The heart which feels the slightest suspicion against the hatred of heresy is not yet converted. God is far from reigning over it, yet with an undivided sovereignty. The paths of higher sanctity are absolutely barred against it. Amongst the one important measures he took to bring about these conversions was a pamphlet entitled Grounds for Remaining in the Anglican Communion, dated January 1846. This dealt at length with his own conversion. It was written in the form of a letter to a friend, starting with comments on the prominence given by Catholics as contrasted with Protestants to the need of the salvation of each single soul. He tells his friend that he must either acknowledge some authority in his church to which he is willing to submit or examine his position for himself with his own mental powers and in constant prayer. The first of these alternatives he considers impossible in the Anglican Church. The second, therefore, he insists on continuing. If the result of that investigation is to cast over you a horrible, overwhelming doubt as to whether you are not in a position most disadvantageous to your soul, then act as a man would act who cares for nothing else but his soul. Other important features of the pamphlet are devoted to an exposure of the false character of the grounds usually relied on by those who remained Anglicans and to arguments against the validity of Anglican orders. One of his most notable converts these days was Mr. Hutcheson, an undergraduate of Trinity College, Cambridge. This man became one of his most intimate lifelong friends. Others who kept him very busy were the little band of converts who followed him from Elton to Birmingham. As these had lived at Elton a quasi-religious life, they now wished to resume the same mode of living in their new home. Their wishes met with Faber's hearty approval. Accordingly, with Dr. Wiseman's sanction, he once again formed them into a community. This action of his, however, called for a striking trust in Providence, as it was very hard to foresee how this little community would effend a means of keeping soul and body together. The evidence of that trust we have in a written statement of his dated Decembersta, 1845. Hope by the end of next week, he wrote, to get all my dear monks around me in a little hovel here. How we are to be supported I do not know. Mutual love is next door to victuals and drink, and it is some comfort to me that I shall be simply on a level with them, and live like a poor man. I hope a monastery may grow out of it in time, and I shall go to Italy in a few months to see Eiffel can get means towards it. With them, he took up residence at 77 Caroline Saint on December 19th, 1845. Although at first they had no definite rule, Faber acted as their superior. Some of them he trained as lay brothers to assist the local clergy by visiting the sick, giving instructions and similar duties. To those who were to be choir brothers, he was later on to assign other work. The life they led was characterized by extreme asceticism and poverty. Despite these austerities, however, they were all intensely happy. Of the trying yet happy life which they led, Mr. Hutcheson, who paid a visit to the community a few days after its establishment, has left us the following account. I visited them on the 22nd. Preparations for dinner were going on. The superior was acting as cook, and though terribly scorched by the fire, was perseveringly stirring without ceasing a kettle full of pea soup. The furniture of the house was very scanty. They had certainly a chair apiece, and a long deal table for their meals. Each had also a knife and fork and a mug. A benefactor had given them some pewter spoons with the temperance pledge stamped on them, and as they were too poor and too ascetic to drink anything stronger than tea, the pledge was not likely to be broken. A small, round, three-legged deal table, split across the center, and a Windsor armchair completed the furniture of this room. The front parlor, which served as a refectory, recreation room, and parlor for guests. Behind the refectory was a miserable back kitchen and upstairs 4 small rooms. One of these was used as the chapel. It had no furniture whatever, not even an altar, but only a crucifix on one wall. Here they assembled at fixed hours and recited various litanies and other prayers. The other rooms were dormitories. The beds were all on the floor, as they could not afford to buy bedsteads. And there was an old second-hand chest of drawers in which Faber kept his clothes. His bed was on the ground like the rest. It will be understood from all this that the life they led was an extremely hard one. In fact, I believe they depended in a great measure at this time on alms for their daily food. Still, everyone seemed very happy and cheerful, Faber especially so, though his health was suffering a good deal, and he often had violent headaches brought on by the hardships he was undergoing. Yet, for all this contentment with austere ways, it became clear, after a little while, that the community could not continue to exist without external assistance. Fully realizing this, Faber decided to go to Italy in the hope of interesting in his project a friend who once led him to believe that he might one day help him financially. This journey he was able to undertake through alms received at the time. During Faber's absence, this alms made partial provision for the brothers. To complete their means of maintenance, they were obliged to seek employment from some of the Catholic tradesmen in the city. This they soon succeeded in obtaining. After their day's work, they returned every evening to their home. To their spiritual needs, Father Moore undertook to attend as superior. Chapter 7. Third Major Continental Journey. On February 2nd, 1846, Faber with Hutcheson, whom he persuaded to accompany him, left Birmingham for the continent. After a few days in London, they proceeded by Southampton to Faber, which they reached on February 8th. On that day, it may be of interest to note, they started the recital together of the Divine Office. Their next important stop was Sens. Here they visited the relics of St. Thomas of Canterbury in the cathedral. It was here, too, that it occurred to Faber to give a complete rule to his community. From Sens they went to Lyons. In that city they were amused to read a pastoral letter from the Archbishop giving directions for ceremonies of thanksgiving for the conversion of such men as Newman, Faber, and Oakley. From Lyons they traveled to Marseille, whence they went by sea to Leghorn. After that, their next stop of note was Florence. During a few weeks' sojourn there, they attended many of the city's Catholic devotions. Florence they left on March 25th, hoping to be able to reach Rome in time for their Easter communion. On the 28th of the same month, they arrived at Foligno. After leaving Foligno, they made a slight detour to arrive on the 30th at Loreto. Here they were greatly impressed by a visit to the Holy House. To Faber especially, whose devotion to Our Lady was most ardent and childlike, it brought intense delight. Thence they proceeded directly to Rome. Throughout this journey, Faber's thoughts often turned to the little community he had left behind him in Birmingham. Knowing that his absence added to their other troubles a considerable trial, with that unwearying solicitude which was ever his for those entrusted to his care, he dispatched from every one of his stopping places a letter to someone of its members bearing words of encouragement and exhortation to the brothers to persevere in their vocation. For this purpose, he especially stressed the spiritual worth of obedience, self-sacrifice, fulfillment of God's will, and devotion to Our Lady. From one of these letters we cannot resist quoting at length for its wealth of paternal solicitude and spiritual sincerity and tenderness. It is one which deals with devotion to the Blessed Virgin. Written from Florence and dated March 21st, 1846, it said, "We are all of us now preparing to celebrate the feast of our sweet mother, the Annunciation, and so I will begin my letter to you with her and try to persuade you to become very devoted to her, a true son, and a loving one, and then she will be a loving mother to you. Alas, We belong to a country where the people think it fine to talk against the mother of Jesus. They really seem to think that they please Jesus when they refuse to pay honor to his mother, whom he loved so tenderly and whom he has now exalted to the brightest glory. Let us then, when we become monks, make it one of our chief ends to make up in our poor way to this sweet mother for the ignorant rudeness of the Protestants. Without great devotion to the Blessed Virgin, it is quite impossible ever to arrive at Christian perfection, and indeed, many of the chief doctors of the Church think it is impossible to be saved without devotion to her. You are full of strong feelings of love. When you become a monk, your heart will long for a mother besides your earthly mother. A mother who can be always near you, always full of love to you, always as able as she is ready to help you in heaven above. Mary is the mother of monks, so she must be your mother and mine. O sweet lady, dearest mother, be a mother to us too, now and in the hour of our death. Of course, there cannot be any manner of doubt, but that Mary can obtain from Jesus all that we want for our salvation and perfection. And if we know beyond a doubt that Mary can obtain all we want for our salvation and perfection, I am sure we can have no doubt but that she wishes to obtain it for us, wishes to obtain it even more than we wish it ourselves, because we are so dull and cold and formal and heartless and self-loving, and are always missing grace because we have not love enough to ask for it. Do you not remember how she stood at the foot of the cross and watched the passion of her Son, how she counted the minutes and the drops of blood, how she looked up and would fain have wiped the clotted blood from out of his beautiful eyes, but she could not reach so far, how every pang went into her soul like a sword? And do you think she does not long with all the longing of a wonderful mother to increase the fruit of that dear, awful passion? Throw yourself, then, into her loving arms, promise to be her son, to love her as Jesus did, and to do all your little common actions as a servant, just as Jesus did all his common actions in the house of Nazareth. Oh, how happy, how quiet will your life be if you can live it so. How happy shall I be in 7 or 8 weeks' time to find you living so, and then to take you to live with me, to edify me, and to set me a good example, to help me with your prayers, and to make me happy with your obedience and your love. This love and devotion to the Holy Virgin Mother of Jesus is one of the chief marks of difference between Catholics and Protestants, and so ought to be more precious to us who have been brought out of the darkness of Protestantism and have to try to make up for the coldness and the forgetfulness of our past life towards the Most Holy Virgin. They reached Rome on the Saturday preceding Palm Sunday. On arrival, they drove directly to the English College. There they received a warm welcome from Dr. Grant. To them he offered the hospitality of the college during their stay in the Eternal City. This invitation Faber gladly accepted. Of his stay in the college, he took advantage to hold many consultations with Dr. Grant concerning his plans for his new community. These plans he also submitted to Cardinal Acton. Of the financial problem which brought him to Rome, he met with an unexpected solution. His companion, Mr. Hutcheson, offered to become a member of the new community and bestow on it his resources. He spent Easter week with the English College at Monte Porcio. From there, he took part in excursions to Tusculum, Nemi, Albano, and Genazzano. After that, he had an audience with Pope Gregory XVI. Of that audience, Mr. Hutcheson had this to say: His Holiness received us most kindly and was reminded by Dr. Grant that some years before Faber had been presented to him when he was an Anglican, and that His Holiness' blessing had not been without effect. When the Pope learned what was the annual value of the living which Faber had given up, he seemed a good deal impressed, and slapping him on the shoulder said, "Ah, that was a fine patrimony." The interview ended by his giving us his blessing and telling us to go back to England and convert as many of our friends as we could. Words in which we pleased ourselves in seeing a certain mission and authorization of our plans. His sojourn in Rome was brief owing to anxiety about his community. On April 25th, he began his homeward journey. This took him to Civita Vecchia, and from there, by boat to Leghorn. After Leghorn, his next important stop was Florence. After a few days in Florence, he traveled rapidly to Genoa, Turin, and Mont Cenis till he reached Annecy. Here, he venerated the relics of St. Francis de Sales and of St. Jane Francis de Chantal. Thence he proceeded by Geneva, Strasbourg, and down the Rhine to Cologne till he reached Ostend. From Ostend, he sailed for London on May 16th. That same day saw him back in Birmingham. Chapter 8. Work with Brothers of the Will of God. On Faber's return to his community, he found them owners of a new home. During his absence in Italy, a Mr. Watts Russell had procured for them a more commodious residence in Colmore Terrace, Birmingham. To this home, the community moved a fortnight after the arrival of Faber. The community at Colmore Terrace were known, with the bishop's permission, as Brothers of the Will of God. They took 3 simple vows. They were placed under the patronage of Our Lady, St. Joseph, and St. Wilfrid. From the last saint, they were sometimes known as Wilfridians. The community consisted of Faber, who took the name of Brother Wilfrid of the Humanity of Jesus, 3 choir and 9 lay brothers. Their new status and home, however, still left them with a very austere mode of life. Of this, one of the community provides us with the following description. We had 3 abstinence days in the week, and breakfast, to an Englishman usually the most comfortable meal, was rendered very much the reverse by being taken standing and consisting of dry bread and tea without sugar. Butter and permission to sit were given on festivals. We rose at 5:30. At 6 we assembled in the room fitted up as a chapel for half an hour's meditation in common. Then the choir brothers said the hours, after which we went to St. Chad's for Mass in parties of 2 or 3. After Mass and communion, we returned to Colmore Terrace to breakfast. Then came a short visit to the chapel, after which the lay brothers were busy in household work. At 12:30, the choir brothers said Vespers and Compline and the others. Then came dinner, during which there was spiritual reading. This was followed by recreation, up to which the rule of silence was observed from the beginning of the day, except on Sundays and festivals. The afternoon was left tolerably free till about 5. Then came matins and lauds. After tea and recreation, we generally assembled in the chapel to receive instructions in mental prayer, examination of conscience, and such subjects from Brother Wilfrid. After this followed the giving of the meditation for the morrow, the rosary of the $7, and other night prayers of the community. The brothers were encouraged to practice other devotions during the day and to use the discipline in their own rooms. The brothers wore a black cassock with wide sleeves. On their breast was a cross with the letters VD, Voluntas Dei, in red cloth. Round their waist was a black leathern girdle from which a rosary was suspended. The choir brothers wore the Roman collar, but the lay members only a stock. The object of the institute, so far as the choir brothers were concerned, was the provision of a body of priests ready to undertake the charge of any good work entrusted to them by the bishop or the parochial clergy. Where such work entailed the hearing of confessions, they were pledged to receive at any time of the day penitents seeking their assistance. The work of the lay brothers we have already described. For the first few weeks, the community had to put up with many inconveniences, as their new residence they found insufficiently spacious for their purpose. By the month of May, however, these problems disappeared through the acquisition of an adjoining house. That addition to their home allowed them to have the luxury of a library and a chapel large enough for the whole community. At the back lay had a garden which, although a rather dismal-looking place with smoky fruit trees and sickly evergreens, eliminated the necessity of walking in the town for exercise. After surmounting these troubles, the work at Colmore Terrace made steady progress, despite the fact that the community became the object of many ill-natured reports. Amongst these rumors, the most keenly felt were charges, on the part of old Catholics, of fickleness, of the likelihood of a reversion to heresy, and of a lack of true devotion to Our Lady. Such was the progress made that by July 1846, the brothers began to consider the erection of a larger chapel in which they could occasionally have some popular exercises. However, before the time for starting this building had arrived, something happened to effect a change in their intentions. This was an offer, that same month, from Lord Shrewsbury, a great admirer of Faber, of Cotton Hall, and a piece of land adjoining the church at Cheadle, which had cost him 1730, to the community. This offer Faber made the subject of considerable thought and prayer before he came to a decision concerning it. His reasons for so doing he gives us in the following letter, dated August 2nd, 1846, to Mr. Watts Russell. I am so startled with the possibility of doing what is not God's sweet, peaceful will that I have begged for time, and Lord S. had kindly granted it. The Birmingham people are affectionately up in arms against our going, and Lord S. found the feeling so strong that he said he would be contented with affiliation, and says I may divide his offer if I please, and take Cheadle without Cotton or Cotton without Cheadle, if I can't manage both. Thus the offer has been the means of showing us that we are more esteemed here than we had any notion of. But I don't see how affiliation can be managed so early. They do not like the idea of being separated from me, any of them, and think they are not sufficiently trained in the spirit of the rule and order. Then again comes the question whether the change of locality will not necessitate some amount of change in the rule, and so in the peculiarity of the Institute. Indeed, the pros and cons are balanced with a perplexing nicety. My simple business as superior is to realize as far as possible the indifferentia of St. Ignatius, and I hope by God's grace that I have done so. The whole congregation is pressing me on in the direction of change, and I feel certainly burdened by the duty of decision. I dread keenly, most keenly, the swerving from the VD in the matter. We are in consequence keeping the month of August to the heart of Mary, and 33 days to St. Joseph, and 18 communions to him, that we may know God's will. And meanwhile I am sad and overweighed, but in perfect peace. They warn us here that if we leave Birmingham, we shall strike a serious blow at the interests of religion generally and give scandal. I fear we have not money enough for a separate filiation. And besides, I think, if it is not conceit, that at present they could not do without me in a house. To be at first more separated from the world, to retire, as converts jealously regarded, from public gaze for preparation, to gain more influence with God first of all, by increased sanctification, to avoid being prematurely forced on work, and so breaking down. These are all in favor of moving. But God willing, I will not decide the question myself. His will is the one thing. It seems to magnify its own sweetness, the longer and the more lovingly we adore it. One is fit to burst out into raptures of venturesome congratulation of God, that his will is so all-strong and we so base and vile, and to wonder that he has not crushed us in the path of some great providence, instead of making such as we are a part and parcel of his overwhelming onward-bearing will. Finally, in the latter part of 1846, Faber felt convinced that it was best to accept Shrewsbury's offer. This acceptance he seems likely to have made on September 1846, whilst attending with two brothers, at Shrewsbury's invitation, the dedication of the Church of St. Giles at Cheadle. The brothers were in possession of their new home early in September. To their residence they gave the name of St. Wilfrid's. Early days in this new religious scene were days packed with labor. Much of this was devoted to making alterations in the grounds by the formation of gardens, walks, and the plantation of trees. This work Faber assidu, ously superintended for his poetic eye, ever loved to have artistry in stone set, where possible, in a becoming framework of nature, the art of God. They were kept busy, too, building a church as the room used for sacred services proved to be inadequate. For this building sufficient funds were found through contributions from 3 of the brothers and a IU from Lord Shrewsbury. The first stone of the new church, which Pugin said would be the only perfect church in England, with an east window he could die for, was laid on October 12, 1846. The day on which this ceremony took place was also signalized by another event which brought novel rejoicing to the community. Brothers Wilfrid, Anthony, and Austin received from Bishop Walsh tonsure and minor orders. A few days later began the community's retreat for the Feast of All Saints. During this retreat, Faber got it into his head that he was called to be a Jesuit. For this idea, the director of the retreat, the Reverend Father Cobb, S.J., could envisage no sound spiritual basis. To him, it seemed to be rooted to a large extent in an unsettled state of mind induced by the anxiety and fatigue of some previous months. Confirming this conviction of the retreat master was the fact that Faber was visited at the end of retreat by a violent attack of nervous fever. This became so serious that on the evening of All Saints, he was anointed. A little later, he made his profession of faith, received the papal blessing, and bade his community farewell. He was, however, soon afterwards restored to health. As a result of the retreat, the brothers resumed their work with added fervor and energy. An important phase of their new activity was the start of some missionary work amongst their neighbors. This was the opening of a school for boys in a loft over the stable. In this school, they had 46 boys before the month of November had passed away. To these children, Faber gave catechism classes on Sundays. Furthermore, to extend the good influence of this catechetical instruction, he encouraged the attendance at these classes of the boys' parents and of other adults. This work, however, was much hampered by the fact that there were yet no priests in the community. Yet for all their zealous labors, the community were far from immune from the attacks of evil-minded people. They, and especially Faber, were made the targets of some of the wildest and most uncharitable remarks. How extreme and absurd some of these were, the following extract from one of Faber's letters will suffice to show. I am said to have strangled one of my monks. The story is all over the land and is believed. Mrs. R. came to see me at St. Wilfrid's to see the man, and glaring at me in silence like a tigress, she told Lady Shrewsbury and Lady Arundel that I was quite capable of all she heard, and that her faith in it was established. A relative of Brother Anthony has written a letter in which I am an ambitious villain and a hellish ruler, and that wherever he goes in London, the finger of scorn is pointed at me. For this cruel castigation, Faber expressed his gratitude to God, believing like John of Avila that one Deo gratias in adversity was worth 1,000 in prosperity, and seeing in it the seal of divine approval of his work and the chastening hand of God leading him to greater self-sanctification. God be praised, he said. This looks like work and vocation and a seal of heavenly love. That obloquy is what I have lately been praying for. God grant that I may have the cup of the Mount of Olives to the dregs. I never felt so utterly to belong to and to love my sweet Jesus as now. In the midst of these sorrows, there came very consoling news to Faber in the latter part of 1846 and the early part of 1847. On December 19th, he was called to Oscott by the bishop to receive at his hands the order of subdeacon. This was followed by another episcopal summons at the close of January to Derby, where he was informed that he was to receive the diaconate on March 21, 1847, and the priesthood on Holy Saturday, April 3rd of the same year. On the occasion of his visit to Derby, it is of interest to note, Faber arranged with Messrs. Richardson of that city the publication of a series of Lives of the Saints, for which he had been for some time preparing. These lives were to be translations of works published in Italy. An agreement was reached whereby 6 volumes should yearly reach the public. The object of this work, as stated in the prospectus, was 1. To supply English Catholics with a cabinet library on interesting as well as edifying reading, especially for families, schools, and religious refectories, which would, for many reasons, be particularly adapted for these times, and would, with God's blessing, act as a counter-influence to the necessarily deadening and chilling effects which the neighborhood of heresy and the consequent prevalence of earthly principles and low views of grace may have on the temper and habits of mind even of the faithful. 2. To present to our other countrymen a number of samples of the fruit which the system, doctrine, and moral discipline established by the Holy and Blessed Council of Trent have produced, and which will be to inquirers really in earnest about their souls an argument more cogent than any that mere controversy can allege. And 3. To satisfy a humble desire which they feel to spread the honor and love of the ever-blessed Queen of Saints, by showing how greatly an intense devotion to her aided in forming those prodigies of heroic virtue with which the Holy Ghost has been pleased to adorn the Church since the schism of Luther, more than in almost any previous times, and whose actions, with a few exceptions, are known to English laymen only in a very general way, and from meager abridgments, while the same motive will prevent the series being confined to modem saints exclusively. From this reliance on good example as an incentive to good living, we can see that the lives of the saints had much to do with Faber's growth in holiness, with his being led to the church wherein these saints grew in sanctity, and with the prominence he was to give to their virtues and teaching in his own spiritual writings. Furthermore, his desire through these lives to promote devotion to Our Lady is another striking proof of his great love of her, and leads us to believe that she had very much to do with his conversion to Catholicism. On his return from Derby, Faber began to make earnest preparation for the great day of his ordination to the priesthood by theological studies, prayer, and penance. Thus did he prepare for his sacred office, because he had a most vivid sense of the august privilege of the priestly ministry, and of his own unworthiness for such a sublime dignity. One's utter indignity, he wrote to Mr. Morris, who was also engaged in the same preparation. To offer the most holy sacrifice is so next to infinite that the very difference between saint and sinner dwindles in looking at it. All you say of yourself is, of course, only a terrific a fortiori for me, whom you have had for years to lug on behind by rebukes and example and secret prayers. I never think of saying Mass without throwing myself at our sweetest mother's feet and holding my peace, even of my own unworthiness. She will give me over, or has done so, to St. Joseph. After his ordination, Father Faber was given charge of the mission of Cotton. The afternoon of the day of his AP appointment found him at his post of duty. On his arrival there, he was accorded a remarkable ovation by his people. Some of his parishioners removed the horses from his carriage and dragged it to St. Wilfrid's. That same evening saw him busy in his confessional. The great joy of his first Mass came to him on Easter Sunday. With that joy, too, came the great resolve of a devoted alter Christus, to devote all, his health and strength to win, his poor countrymen to the true light of the gospel, to console them in all their tribulations, whether of body or of soul, to sacrifice, his own ease and comfort for them, and knowing so well the trials and difficulties of the poor, to endeavor to make religion as easy and as kindly to them as possible, to make the yoke of Jesus what he himself called it, a light yoke and merciful. The fruit of that resolution was soon strikingly in evidence in the work of the brothers of St. Wilfrid's. To render their labors more efficient, Father Faber gave them a better organization. To each of the brothers he assigned a district. In each of these districts, the brother in charge was expected to devote a considerable portion of every day visiting households. During these visits, they tried to persuade people to attend services at St. Wilfrid's. Furthermore, the brothers gave regular instructions in Christian doctrine. To these instructions, many came to listen. As a result of this systematic and intensive drive for souls, Father Faber was soon compelled to preach on Sundays in a yard near the house or in the garden to crowds unable to find accommodation in the church. For these labors, as was to be expected, Father Faber and his brothers were richly rewarded, for he tells us that between Easter and July 22nd, 150 persons had been led from heresy to the haven of truth. Thus came it that in the space of a few months, only one Protestant family in the parish had escaped the conquering zeal of Father Faber and his aides. Successes such as these in a parish surrounded by strongly Protestant districts could scarcely be expected to escape arousing the forces of bigotry against the man from whom they mainly emanated. And so it happened that at this time Father Faber was made the target of much abuse from several Protestant ministers. To these attacks he replied in the following Christian and very effective fashion. What has been the policy of our adversaries and the fashion of their warfare? One clergyman of the establishment rides into our garden on his pony, and refusing to bow or return my salutation, tells me that because I persist in trying to convert his people and visiting them in their own houses, my conduct is neither that of a Christian, a gentleman, or an honest man that he is on the lookout to catch me breaking the penal laws and to make an example of me. You and yours are far more effective Catholic missionaries than we are, and I assure you hardly a week passes without some one or more stragglers being driven into the bosom of the Holy Roman Church, declaring themselves fairly wearied out by the incessant curses fulminated against us from the pulpits of the state church, and humbly echoed back, with fury even wilder still, from the Dissenters' chapel and camp meeting, and desirous to seek a refuge where they hear only of Almighty God, of the love of Jesus, and of duty, charity, peace, and kindly affection towards all, whether Catholic or Protestant. You and your allies of the establishment have, indeed, done our work well and wisely, though most unintentionally. And had you all been our hired and salaried servants, you could not have done it better. We shall go on as heretofore, in the face of secret spite and of unmanly persecution, without one feeling of ill will towards either Methodists, clergymen, or others, and daily praying for them all. Men of peace, yet ready for war when you choose to provoke us to it, but war in your own camp and by your own fireside. And though I am sure you will forgive us if we cannot at all times resist a good-humored joke against you when you persist in laying yourself open to it, one thing, by God's grace, you will not provoke us to, and that is one really uncharitable thought or one really unkindly word. And you yourself should always have a good-tempered and a smiling welcome if ever you choose to call upon us. And while from state church and Methodist camp, the furious thunder of anathemas and curses week after week breaks the blessed stillness of the Holy Sabbath, we will be content to go in our old way, preaching Jesus Christ and Him crucified, and love to the poor, whom Jesus left behind Him to fill His place and for His followers to love. That a community with such zealous efficiency to its credit should be considered by Father Faber fit for the taking of vows was not surprising. Accordingly, he communicated concerning this matter with Bishop Wiseman, the administrator of the London district. Before hearing from the bishop, however, Father Faber received news which was to change completely his plans respecting his brothers. He heard of the imminent return of Newman from Rome as superior of the congregation of the oratory. This information kindled in him the desire to be in that congregation a religious subject of the man whose spiritual advice in Anglican days he so profoundly revered. Of the motives which led him to desire this change and of the pain this decision cost him, he tells us at length in a letter of December 10th, 1847, to Mr. Watts Russell. On the feast of St. Andrew, St. Wilfrid's patron saint, he wrote, I chose for my next morning's meditation St. Joseph's delay about putting Our Lady away, and his sorrow, and, reflecting on my own responsible position, I asked as the fruit of my meditation the gift of counsel and the grace of prudence. The next morning I rose at 5 and made my meditation. It was full of distractions, but I took pains with it, although I had no particular sweetness in it, nor was there anything signal about it in any way. Towards the conclusion, when making my colloquies and repeating my petition for counsel and prudence, when nothing was farther from my thoughts, all on a sudden I felt an interior call to join the oratory of St. Philip, and in one instant all the perplexity of the faculties of my soul, which I had experienced for some weeks, was calmed. I ought to have told you, by the way, that we were preparing to take our vows. I immediately set myself to work on my knees to argue against this call and to combat it in every way. I appealed to St. Joseph, our own special patron and superior, but he seemed to answer that God's will was his great end, and that we were to go with other like things. I then took the relic of St. Philip, and I appealed to him as now enjoying the beatific vision, and having no self-love about his own institute, but he seemed to answer that all had been his doing hitherto, and now as the consummation, that I had begun to translate his life at Elton, that he had been my model there, that my rule was only an expression of his spirit adapted to England. I then tried to throw myself back upon a certain repugnance I had always felt, but I found it was gone, thawed away in some mysterious manner. One then went and said Mass for the anime sante. Though I could scarcely tell what I was doing, yet I was wonderfully calm. My Thanksgiving was, of course, entirely occupied with this matter. Elton was to come over again. The will of God was to hunt me out of my new home, to snap all ties. So I passed, little indeed to my thinking, once again to the calm broken-heartedness of the past, and I let God strip me as he pleased. I had now to face my choir brothers, whose aversion to the plan was very vehement, and as we were to take our vows shortly, no time was left me to prepare things. That same day, Wednesday, I took Father Hutchison out and told him the whole. He immediately said, "It is from God, I will go with you." The same happened with Brother Alban and Brother Austin. This seemed wonderful. I then proposed that I should go down to the Jesuits to make a retreat, and to make out if all this really came from God. The next morning a letter came from Dr. Wiseman, fixing that Father Hutchison and I should come up to town on the Immaculate Conception BVM to take our vows. This letter made us consider how far it would be well to go down to Stonyhurst without Dr. Wiseman's knowledge and permission, as he had been our director all along. So Father Hutchison and I started for London at once. Strange to say, the first Oratorian in England, Father Stanton, in the habit, arrived just before us and was with the bishop in Golden Square. I was up with the bishop till midnight on Thursday. He solemnly approved of the whole as coming from God and being his adorable will. The next day, St. Francis Xavier, we both said Mass for it, and afterwards the bishop pronounced definitively that so it was to be. To negotiate accordingly concerning this projected change, Father Faber went in January 1848 to interview Newman at Maryvale. As a result of the meeting, the fathers of the oratory decided to admit to their society the Brothers of the Will of God on February 10th, 1848. The joy bomb of that news was not, however, without its concomitant sorrow. The decision to leave Cotton Hall brought much displeasure to his old and very good friends, the Shrewsbury and to the neighboring priests who had found in the brothers such zealous and efficient helpers. But the joy which now possessed him in the oratory far surpassed any grief experienced. To this, the following words penned on February 17th, 1848, bear exuberant testimony. Since my admission, I seem to have lost all attachment to everything but obedience. I could dance and sing all day because I am so joyous. This was indeed an enthusiasm for a new religious milieu which seemed worthy to be called the genius of sincerity. Chapter 9. At the oratories of Maryvale and St. Wilfrid, on February 21st, 1848, Father Faber received his call to the new novitiate at Maryvale. He was there only a few days when he was sent back to St. Wilfrid's for the solemn opening of the new church. His exertions there preparing the church for the opening ceremony, added to previous Lenten work preaching in several London churches, brought upon him a severe attack of rheumatism which lasted for many days. As his state of health continued till May to be poor, he was sent to the coast of Yorkshire for a change of air. In that place he resided for 3 weeks. While there, it is of interest to note, he wrote, one night at Scarborough, at the request of Father Hutchison, his first 2 and now very popular hymns, Mother of Mercy and the Blessed Sacrament. Restored health found him active again in July. During that month, important engagements were participation in the opening of St. George's Cathedral, Southwark, and preaching a sermon within the octave in the same church. Towards the close of July, he was released from the obligation of doing the usual 3 years novitiate required by the oratory. With this dispensation came his appointment as novice master. As novice master, his stay at Maryvale was to be of brief duration. The whole community found it necessary to move to the larger house of St. Wilfrid's in October 1848 because of the increase of the congregation through the arrival of postulants. In this new house, the community, now numbering 40, were able to perform their exercises in a much more satisfactory manner. There were frequent services for the people in which the ceremonies of the church were carried out with exemplary regularity. Of these services, the public showed their appreciation by their regular and devoted attendance. The Blessed Sacrament, too, was sometimes taken in procession to the houses of the sick. To the consolation brought to Father Faber by this missionary work, there soon came a damper born of a controversy which arose within the ranks of his fellow Catholics concerning his series of Lives of the Saints. Few prominent hereditary Catholics considered these lives entirely satisfactory. Objection was taken to these biographies as injudicious because unsuited to the conditions of English Catholics and likely to disgust and repel Protestants. This opposition found acute expression in an article on the life of St. Rose of Lima by a well-known writer published in Dolman's magazine for September 1848. This reviewer, whilst maintaining that a good biography of a saint of God is an invaluable work, insisted that its great end was edification. Its object should not be the recording of incredible austerities or astounding miracles. Where the recorded actions of saints, it said, strictly agree with the precepts and counsels of the Gospels, they are the useful and practical pattern of true sanctity. Where they are otherwise, when they utterly oppose themselves to the natural end and being of man, they are worthy neither of admiration nor imitation, and had far better be consigned to respectful oblivion. They give wrong impressions of what true piety consists in. They reduce religion to an unmeaning course of puerilities. Towards the close of this article appeared these vehement words of protest. In the name of all those who know their religion, in the name of all those who revere it in its innate and immaculate purity and truth, we protest most solemnly against this and such like publications. However painful to our feelings, we must not shrink from a public and sacred duty in thus exposing the dangerous tendencies of this species of modern hagiology. For some time, these attacks left Father Faber unmoved. When, however, it was learned that the ecclesiastical authorities of the district had expressed a wish for their discontinuance, he decided, in deference to the advice of Newman, who had no sympathy whatsoever for the views of the opposition, to suspend their publication on October 30th, 1848, for the sake of peace. This, too, he did, although convinced that doing so would mean a retardation to conversions and a concession to the ignorance of many Catholics. Writing concerning this matter to Bishop Waring on November 16, 1848, he said, "You will get this on the morning of St. Hugh, the day you kindly received me into the church 3 years ago. How little did we, whom the lives of Catholic saints helped so much towards conversion, then dream that the Catholics of England should be so frightened, ashamed, or unsympathetic, whichever it may be, as to refuse to tolerate Catholic lives of their own saints from Catholic pens and with Catholic imprimators, and that we, for whom it might have been feared that we should not become Catholic enough, should be authoritatively silenced for overmuch sympathy with the Catholics of other lands. Alas, if we could but make our fellow Catholics feel how this policy lowers the Church in the eyes of our Protestant countrymen. For us, obedience is better than sacrifice. But the effect of this step in Oxford and elsewhere will be far beyond what any of you believe, just when we are expecting another great move there. Converts may surely claim to know best what will convert others, but it is a sad confession on the part of Catholic authorities that the English Catholics are unable to digest the literature of Catholic countries and start away from what is not found too strong even for their Protestant countrymen. That some of these things in the lives distasteful to English ways of thinking should have been eliminated, we believe, had Father Faber been guided by prudence rather than by excessive religious ardor and a partial Latin temperament strongly in sympathy with the Italian Catholic mentality. After all, what fundamentally mattered for his purpose in the lives was what they revealed of high virtuous example. In the meantime, however, several friends of the lives throughout England began to rally to his side. Many able articles in the tablet did much pleading on his behalf. Further support he found in the form of letters from all parts of the country lamenting the suspension and expressing the hope that it was temporary. These, too, renewed his confidence in his work by revealing to him many instances of the good thereby effected. And finally, the author of the article on the life of St. Rose apologized and recanted in a new number of Dolman. Besides, he penned a very humble apology to Bishop Ullathorne and another to Father Faber. To quote Father Hutchison, in both of these he expresses the greatest sorrow for what he has written, and for the scandal he has given, and also for the way in which he attacked Father Faber. His apology is everything that could be wished. He says that he has regretted the article ever since it was written, and that he shall regret it to the last day of his life. He assures Father Faber that he had never read the life of St. Rose till it was thrust into his hand by another who urged him to attack it as he had done. The most satisfactory thing in the apology, however, is that it is the generous apology of a Christian and not merely of a man who has been horsewhipped. This reaction soon attained to such proportions that the continuation of the lives seemed quite justifiable. Accordingly, work on this matter was resumed on the Feast of the Epiphany, 1849. The resumption of the series was announced in the following circular. The congregation of the Oratory is now enabled to take upon itself and to continue the series of Lives of Saints, which was begun some time since by the Reverend Father Faber and has lately been suspended. The Fathers have never yet been formally responsible for that series, their connection with it being limited to the accident that, when it was already in course of publication, its editor joined their body. On taking this step, the editor felt, as they did, that some new arrangement was required by the altered position in which he stood, and that either they must take his work upon themselves, or he must bring it to a close. They postponed the determination of so important a question to the end of the current year, when, by accidental coincidence, a strong opposition to the series manifested itself in one quarter of the English Catholic body, resting for support, as was supposed, on venerable names, which necessarily commanded their most serious attention and deference. Anxious not to involve the congregation in a party contest at the commencement of its course, the Fathers forthwith came to the decision of not committing themselves to the publication for the present, and in consequence recommended the editor to suspend it. It is both a surprise and a great consolation, and they give thanks and praise to the Father of Mercies and to the intercession of the saints, whose lives were the subject in dispute, that they are enabled, after so short an interval, with the kind wishes of their ecclesiastical superiors, of the heads of colleges and religious bodies, and of all generally whose good opinion they covet, and by whose judgment they desire to be guided, nay, at the express instance of those parties who had been foremost in the opposition, to take upon themselves a responsibility from which, without such general countenance and encouragement, they felt themselves justified in shrinking. And they hope they may without presumption accept it in some sort as a reward for the readiness with which they gave up their own wishes to 84. The claims of Christian charity and peace, that the very suspension of the series has been the means of eliciting an expression of sympathy towards themselves, and it, so cordial and unanimous, and testimonies to the good it was effecting so decisive, as to allow of their undertaking it consistently with the edification of their brethren and with comfort to themselves. Accordingly, they propose in the ensuing August, when the last volume promised by Father Faber is to be published, to transfer the editorship from him to themselves. And meanwhile they earnestly beg of the good friends who have given him so zealous a support, to assist them also with their prayers, that they may continue this important work with that wisdom and discretion which become the glorious saints to whose honor it is dedicated. The last months of 1848 were very busy ones for Father Faber. With Father Dalgairns, he conducted a mission at Land End in the Potteries. A little later, in Advent, he gave the ordination retreat of his novices. And at the close of the Christmas holidays, he went to London to preach the panegyric of St. Thomas of Canterbury in the Saints' Church at Fulham. Soon after these busy days, there came another change in the location of the oratory, as it was the rule of the congregation that a town should always be the site of an oratory. St. Wilfrid's could not be the permanent home. This town Father Newman was able to provide on January 25th, 1849, when he moved a portion of his community to a house in Alcester, St. Birmingham. Father Faber, however, continued to reside at St. Wilfrid's both as novice master and as the priest in charge of the mission. In his parochial work, he was assisted by Father Hutcheson. Chapter 10. At the King William St. Oratory, London. A few months after the arrival of the Fathers from St. Wilfrid's, it was decided to erect another oratory in London. This decision was due to the following factors. It partly met the wishes of Dr. Wiseman, who had urged Newman to transfer the whole oratory to London. To please to this extent Dr. Wiseman was the keen desire of the Oratorians, because for their congregation he had for a long time evinced a great love. He had once been a brother of the little oratory in Rome. Furthermore, he had promised St. Philip that he would do his best to introduce the oratory to England, a pledge he had been able to fulfill to the extent of starting the idea of an English oratory many years before its actual founders became members of the church, and of guiding Newman's vocation into the congregation. Furthermore, from the point of view of personnel, it was easy to found a new oratory, as the Birmingham house had more fathers than it needed. And a final favoring factor was the fact that Mr. Lewis, an old friend of many of the fathers, brought to St. Wilfrid's for Holy Week the Earl of Arundel and Surrey and Mr. Fullerton, gentlemen who promised the fathers their support if they made the London foundation. Newman decided to remain in Birmingham and to send Faber to London to take charge of the new establishment. Before proceeding to London, Father Faber with Father Hutcheson left on April Ioth for Birmingham to spend a week there. In the meantime, Mr. Lewis got his eye on what he considered a suitable premise for the new oratory. As soon as Father Faber saw this building, he expressed his satisfaction therewith. Accordingly, he secured a lease of 24 and 25 William St. the Strand. For its rent, 3 members of the congregation made themselves responsible. This, however, they never found it necessary to pay. To this new home, several members came on April 28, 1849. Their first piece of work was the construction of an altar. On this, Father Faber said Mass on the following day. After that, they worked strenuously at the chapel till they had it ready for services on May 31st. On that day, Dr. Wiseman assisted pontifically and preached. After Vespers, Father Newman preached in the presence of the bishop. Thus was launched the first public church in the district to be served by a religious community. Early days in London were far from being untroubled days for the Oratorians. The men from whom Catholic Birmingham was so loath to part soon found that many of their co-religionists in the metropolis regarded them as intruders and viewed askance some of the methods they introduced. The secular clergy were opposed to them as men not engaged in parochial work, yet tending to wean their flocks away from them. Their methods as those of converts and untried men, many of the descendants of the old Catholic faithful, regarded with conservative antipathy. In the words of Mr. Wilfred H. Woolen, the methods of the Oratorians aroused much comment. The marks of the penal laws were still upon the Catholics in England. By tradition retiring, many of the hereditary English Catholics disliked the prominence into which the Oratorians and their friends brought the whole Catholic body. Moreover, the new devotions the Oratorians introduced from abroad, their popular hymns and their style of preaching presented Catholic piety at an angle which some were too insular to appreciate. While the soundness of the religion of these descendants of the martyrs was never in question, it was not always proof against a certain narrowness of outlook. One of the customs to which particular objection was taken was the wearing by these fathers of their religious habit in public, which was considered far too daring in a land which had so recently experienced the rigors of the penal code. Such indeed was the antipathy aroused by their practices that some went so far as to lodge formal complaints about them with the bishop, in which it was asserted that their services were more methodistical than Catholic. Of these devotions, it is curious to note, one to which great exception was taken was that of the 7 offerings of the precious blood, later so generally in use. Before long, however, these suspicions and prejudices were dissipated by the success of the experiment. Besides, many of the oratory's greatest critics became its best admirers. Another signal proof of this change of attitude was the fact that many of the priests of the London churches began to copy the services of the congregation and use Father Faber's hymns. With this change of attitude came a much larger attendance at the morning and evening services of the Oratory Church. The work of the Oratory was interrupted for a few weeks during the summer of 1849, whilst the decoration of the church was being completed. Of the suspension of activities, Fathers Faber, Hutchison, and Wells took advantage to visit the principal towns of Belgium. Early autumn found him quite busy again amongst the Irish hop pickers of East Farley, Kent, where an epidemic of cholera was causing widespread suffering and death. To these stricken laborers, he and two of his fathers went at the request of Mr. Wilberforce, the Protestant rector of the place. During his stay in that locality, it is of interest to note, he became very intimate with the rector and his family. The fruit of that intimacy was the reception of Mr. Wilberforce and his family into the church in the course of the following year. His return from the hop fields in November 1849 to the Oratory brought him even busier days than those he had spent amongst the afflicted Irish laborers. Writing on November 21st to Reverend J.B. Morris about those work-packed days, he said, "We are in the full swing of work, lawyers, medical students, etc., pouring pell-mell into the church. I have received 12 quite lately, but we keep them snug. I am worked off my legs, and as Edward Bagg Shaw, who put on the habit today, will tell you, can hardly get through my controversial and spiritual correspondence. The success of the Oratory has been certainly most marvel louse. We have nearly 500 communions a week now." Father Faber's next important missionary efforts came a little before and during Lent of 1850. He gave a retreat in the Oratory Church for those anxious to lead the higher type of Christian life. During that retreat, he preached a 2 hours meditation every morning and a 2 hours conference every afternoon for a fortnight. That done, he forthwith delivered a large portion of the Lenten sermons and preached on Good Friday the devotion of the 3 hours agony. And such was the energy he displayed, despite frequent headaches, throughout all this work that it was said of him, "Father Wilfred is working more like a steam engine than a man. Whether he is well or not, I don't know, but his work is something prodigious." So keen a happiness did he now derive from labor for souls that he could very truly say, "I like work, it fascinates me. I love to keep it by me. The idea of getting rid of it nearly breaks my heart." For the next outstanding event in his life, we pass to the 3-sermon course which he preached before the feast of St. Philip on May 26th. These pulpit utterances were afterward seen in print under the title of The Spirit and Genius of St. Philip Neri. After this, a noteworthy happening was his formal erection on the first Sunday of July of the Confraternity of the Precious Blood. This was approved by a papal rescript on August 12, 1850. The formation of this confraternity was largely due to Father Faber's great personal devotion to the precious blood. These days, so filled with work, took such a toll of Father Faber's strength that he was compelled to seek short intervals of rest during the summer of 1850. These he spent, for the most part, in a small house taken for the season at Lawn Sing in Sussex. This house was placed at his disposal by an old friend, Mr. W. G. Ward. There, Mr. Ward, a theologian of note, paid him many a visit during which many a profound discussion arose bearing on the science of God. By now, Father Faber's strenuous labors had been crowned with such success that his superior felt convinced that the time had arrived to confer an independent status on the London Oratory. This, too, was deemed necessary because of the rule that Oratorian communities were supposed, when such was feasible, to be autonomous. The London community, accordingly, were released on October 9, 1850, with much regret and sorrowful hearts, from their obedience to Father Newman. Although this official recognition of good work done brought much joy to Father Faber, it also troubled his humble soul, lest it might entail his being chosen as superior to the new independent oratory. Voicing his fear, he wrote on October 10th, 1850, to the Earl of Arundel as follows: "I cannot look without alarm on the prospect of being elected Father Superior to More Row, and the interests and credit of St. Philip's family in the hugest city in the world being entrusted to such as I am. The very thought makes one wish that all the world could know what I really am, that they might hate me and put me into a perpetual Coventry, which would be my desert. And yet, when I am elected, for all I know I shall have moments of self-complacency about it, instead of seeing that my elevation will simply be an evil out of which God will magnify himself by bringing forth good, and it will be privilege enough for me to be an ugly foil to the beauty of his sweet providence. His fears were realized, for next day he was elected to this office, and that tribute to his personal sanctity and governing wisdom he was to receive every 3 years till death claimed him. If the year 1850 brought to Father Faber and his brethren many consolations, it also brought them many sorrows. These came to them through the establishment of the Catholic hierarchy in England towards the close of the year. This action moved to keen resentment Protestant London, which considered a resurrected hierarchy nothing less than a popish invasion. Of this resentment, the oratory was made a special target because of its aggressive prominence and convert-making successes. Of the persecution to which the fathers were subjected, Father Faber writes as follows on the feast of St. Gertrude, 1850, to Mr. Watts Russell. "London is a frightful place for work. I dare say you see the English papers, and therefore you know in what plight we are just now in England. We have the honor of bearing rather more than our share of the public indignation, which may be partly owing to the Bishop of London's honoring us by a charge. All over the walls you see, 'Down with the Oratorians,' 'Beware of the Oratorians,' 'Don't go to the oratory,' 'Banishment to the Oratorians,' and in Leicester Square, a triple placard of singular truthfulness, 'No Popery,' 'Down with the Oratorians,' 'No religion at all.' We are cursed in the streets. Even gentlemen shout from their carriage windows at us. All this is well, but the real anxiety is how our own people will conduct themselves." To this persecution he replied by an increase in asceticism and prayer, twin weapons on which he constantly relied for telling spiritual triumphs. Despite these attacks of the intolerant, the early part of 1851 saw several Anglican clergymen received into the church. One of the most distinguished of these was Archdeacon Manning, who received holy orders from Cardinal Wiseman in the course of the spring and summer. Towards the middle of 1851, the storm of bigotry had spent itself. As a result, the oratory was able to resume its aggressive fight for the faith. This was especially characterized by a drive for the education of children. Accordingly, in June 1851, a committee was formed to provide schools for children of the most destitute Catholics. These were especially intended to counteract the evil influences of the Protestant ragged schools. This committee succeeded in opening a school for boys on October 9, 1851, at Rose Street, Covent Garden. This made such speedy progress that it had to be transferred in the following year to larger premises in Dunn's Passage, Holborn. Here it continued so to prosper that in a brief period it could boast of 1,100 children. And amongst these children so striking was the Reformation in evidence that it won plaudits from one of the Protestant magistrates of the neighboring police court. Again, space becoming too limited for the number of children attending, more roomy buildings had to be acquired in Charles St. Drury Lane. This whole establishment, however, it was eventually decided, because of its distance from the Brompton Oratory and the increasing work of the Fathers, to present, in 1863, to the diocese. These added activities made such inroads on the health of Father Faber that in the summer of 1851 he was compelled to seek a few weeks' rest at the seaside. Despite this respite from work, however, his health, on his return to the oratory, was such as to give much cause for alarm. Indeed, his condition soon became so serious that he had to yield to advice to forsake all work for a few months. Accordingly, with Father Ballard as a companion, he left early in October 1851 for a visit to the Holy Land, a country he had long ardently desired to see. This, however, he was not destined to realize. En route by boat from Marseille to Beirut, he became so ill because of the roughness of the passage that, at Malta, he felt compelled to abandon his pilgrimage. By mid-November, he was well enough to leave Malta for Messina. Thence he went by way of Catania, Palermo, and Naples to Rome. At Messina he preached in Italian to the brothers of the little oratory to their great edification. At Palermo, he had the pleasure of meeting his old friends, the Shrewsburys. His stay in Rome lasted but a few days. There he had the privilege of an audience with Pope Pius X. By the pontiff, he was most graciously received. An index of the Pope's esteem for him we have in the fact that His Holiness asked him what privileges he would like to have. Father Faber replied that he wanted nothing for himself alone, but would be most grateful for the privilege of a daily plenary indulgence for the Church of the Oratory. The Pope's reply to this was, "This must go to the Congregation of Rites." "Ah, Holy Father," retorted Faber, "you can do it yourself if you wish." Thereupon the Pope laughed and signed the paper. The journey homewards was rapid. Traveling by Florence and Genoa, he crossed the Alps by Mont Cenis. He reached London on December 31st, 1851. This hasty return to England far ahead of the time prescribed by his doctors because of anxiety about the oratory left him far from well enough to resume work. Accordingly, he found himself compelled to rest for a few months in a house at Hither Green, near Lewisham in Kent. This place not only provided him with the necessary quiet, but also permitted him to keep an eye on the activities of the oratory. His proximity to London, making frequent visits of his community possible, enabled him to keep closely in touch with the doings of his brethren. Furthermore, from Hither Green, he found it easy to superintend from time to time the building of the country house of the Congregation begun on February 2nd, 1852, at Sydenham Hill. He was not long at Hither Green when his health became greatly improved. By January 22nd, 1852, he was able to say with boyish buoyancy, "I am nearly blown away by the cold winds which send health and joy through every limb and fiber. I struggle across plowed fields and wade through the liquid mud of the lanes in my patent-clumped shoes to my heart's content. I eat like a wolf, I sleep like a top, I am in immense spirits, and how my digestion goes on I am unable to tell you, for I am never in any way reminded of the existence of a stomach, except when I stoop to tie my shoes, an operation which is daily becoming more difficult." With the continuance of this state of health, he decided by summertime that he was in first-class form for work. In July, accordingly, he undertook to preach every evening during the octave of the precious blood. After that, he went to Sydenham to superintend the completion of the oratory's country house. The next month of noteworthy occupation was September 1852. With Father Bagshaw, he then traveled for the first time to Ireland. This journey he had desired for a long time to make, because for the people of that country he had a very particular regard. Many of their racial characteristics strongly appealed to the Latin element in his nature, whilst their historic fealty to the faith won the profound admiration and love of his ardent convert heart. From Ireland, he received an enthusiastic welcome worthy of a great and good friend. Amongst the notable tributes paid him during his stay in Dublin was a request to preach the Triduum at the Jesuits' church in Gardiner Street in honor of the beatification of Blessed Peter Claver. So warmly indeed did the metropolis take him to its heart that it was with difficulty he found time to pay a brief visit to one of his treasured friends, Mr. Monsell of Turvo, near Limerick. On his return to England that same autumn saw him engaged in an undertaking which was to mean great things for the future of the London Oratory. As the community needed a more spacious church and a more suitable house, he purchased at Brompton a plot of ground with a residence known as Blemmel House. This building, being in poor condition, he caused to be pulled down. The plans of the house he conceived to replace it were on a scale of great magnificence, but the cost of their execution compelled him to undertake a building of much more moderate proportions. The new oratory he started building in March 1853. In the meantime, the work at King William Street knew no waning. Daily preaching and constant confessions were maintained. In addition to this came a mission conducted by Father Faber and some of the fathers in the new schools at Dunn's Passage during the first 3 weeks of Advent 1852. The majority of those attending the mission were Irish, Catholic only in name, and very ignorant of Christian doctrine. They came from the very heart of London's worst dens. Although at first the fathers found it very hard to impress these people, Father Faber never relinquished hope of bringing all of them back to God. This he finally succeeded in doing by dramatic words and actions which stirred them to the depths of their being. At the end of an impassioned sermon which had but little moved them, he exclaimed, "How can I touch your hearts? I have prayed to Jesus. I have prayed to Mary. Whom shall I pray to next? I will pray to you, my dear Irish children, to have mercy on your own souls." These words uttered by him as he knelt before them brought the whole congregation of about 1,000 to its knees and moved it to sobs of religious sorrow. This work of conversion he consolidated by hiring rooms after the mission in the neighborhood in which instructions were given, hymns sung and the rosary recited every evening. One more item of interest remains to be recounted in Father Faber's life before the close of 1852. He published an essay on the interest and characteristics of the lives of the saints, dedicated to Cardinal Wiseman, whose kind encouragement, valuable suggestions, and peculiar devotion to the modem saints fostered the beginnings and defended the progress of the English series of their lives. This work not only defended those features of his series of lives which had been attacked, but also showed the influence of the study of hagiography on the whole spiritual life. So strongly indeed did he maintain the power of this influence of saintly lives that he seemed fully in agreement with Dr. Johnson's dictum that example is always more efficacious than precept. The year 1853 was marked by the writing of the first of his great works, All for Jesus. The discussion of this book, however, we leave for a separate chapter. Although this entailed very considerable labor, it did not prevent him from taking his turn preaching at the oratory. From this pressure of work, he got a slight respite by a short visit to Lay's beloved Lake District. After this, there is nothing unusual to record in his life at the King William Street Oratory. The last services W. are conducted there on September 9th, 1853. Chapter 11. At Brompton Oratory. On March 1845, Father Faber with a few fathers and brothers moved to the oratory at Brompton. There the rest of the community joined them within a fortnight. In their new sphere of action, the enforced inactivity of the previous 6 months left them, as it were, straining at the leash for apostolic work. No marvel, then, that these early days we witness at Brompton, under the stirring leadership of Father Faber, a great outburst of missionary activity. By March 22, 1854, he had a temporary church built and equipped for services at an expense of £4,000. Most of the cost of this building the private resources of the fathers suffed. The Earl of Arundel and Surrey also contributed £700 towards its erection. On the opening day of the church, Father Faber preached the sermons at High Mass and Vespers, although harassed by such headaches that it was thought he would not be able to occupy the pulpit. Indeed, it was only at the last moment that he left his bed for his ordeal. After that, he took his regular part at daily confessions begun on the eve of Palm Sunday. To this work, he added a course of lectures which he began to give on Easter Sunday. Besides all this personal work, he saw to it that the fathers took their turns every evening except that of Saturday, at devotions at which sermons were preached, hymns sung, and prayers recited. On these sermons, Father Faber placed great reliance to bring many sinners to repent and lead many converts to the church. "We must be careful," he once said to his congregation in chapter, "not to do anything with the quotidiana parola, which I believe has been the main cause of our success, the foundation of the fullness of our confessionals, and of our not sinking into a district congregation." These services became a focus of attraction for considerable crowds, although at the time but few Catholics resided in the neighborhood. Their drawing power was largely due to the pains taken by Father Faber with every detail. He sedulously superintended the selection of devotions and hymns, the subjects and style of sermons, and the exact performance of every ceremony prescribed by the rubrics. Thus did he evince, for all his poetic and speculative trends, that he could be very pragmatic when planning his conquest of souls. As a result of this supervision, the oratory exercises, especially on Sunday evenings, became so impressive that the wise and holy Mother Mary Hallahan, who occasionally lived close by, once asserted she would have come all the way from her convent in stone on her knees to witness them. As we have now reached the last and most important phase of Father Faber's career, we think it opportune and proper to halt the main course of our narrative for the purpose of giving the reader a fuller and more intimate view of the daily life led by him during this period. At this time, he was a very early riser. For that reason, he was able to have Mass said in the private chapel of the house before the rest of the community had risen from their beds. After Mass, he had a cup of tea. Then came his meditation. Subsequently, he wrote till breakfast. The rest of the morning was spent for the most part in conversation with the fathers, reporting to him the condition of their different charges and receiving from him direction for their management. Thus came it that most of their undertakings outside as well as within the oratory were started through his suggestions, whilst no small part of their success was due to his encouragement and counsel. Sometimes, too, when he happened to be in his room during the rest of the day, he was only too willing to receive any of his priests who wished to see him. And of that welcoming attitude they often took advantage, for meeting this holy and genial superior, they always found not only fruitful, but very enjoyable. Indeed, few there were of his brethren who would not have experienced a blank in a day without a visit to a room which seemed to resurrect amongst them St. Philip's School of Christian Mirth in the Chiesa Nuova. On feast days especially, he took pleasure in seeing his priests as soon as possible. On such occasions, he was particularly careful that even the very neatness of his room should appear to radiate festive cheer. His house he rarely left except for a walk in the garden. So dearly indeed did he cherish seclusion from things mundane that Cardinal Manning felt justified in saying of him, "Of all our contemporaries, few can be found who more entirely and consistently withdrew from the world. He lived within himself, as St. Gregory says of St. Benedict. The rare occasions on which he did go outside saw him for the most part visiting the different charges of his priests, especially their schools at Dunn's Passage, Holborn, and Charles Street, Drury Lane. Thus it happened that most of the recreations he took outside his house were devoted to entertaining small parties of boys at St. Mary's, Sydenham. There the beautiful grounds alone were something well calculated to bring uncommon joy to boyish hearts, subjected in many cases to the drab and cramping conditions of city life. These grounds were mainly the product of his artistic taste. When Father Faber arrived at St. Mary's, he found its surroundings entirely uncultivated, but after a few years under his magic influence, its grounds became so transformed that persons experienced in landscape gardening were full of admiration for the variety of the trees therein collected and for the taste with which they had been arranged. Such was the lovely scene in which he manifested that predilection of the oratory for children, which St. Philip wished to be one of its outstanding characteristics. Little wonder that there the little ones realized that they had in him a very genuine friend. Nor must we forget to mention, too, that the charm which could so fascinate children often attracted on such occasions to St. Mary's prominent men, hungering for contact with a fascinating personality, a brilliant mind, and rare spiritual wisdom. Paying tribute to these sources of attraction, an old friend, at the time of his death, wrote of the indescribable charm of his private intercourse, of that wonderful brilliancy of conversation in which he excelled all those whose social powers have made them the idols of London society as far as they have excelled ordinary men, of the magic play of his countenance and of his voice, of the unprecedented combination of tenderness in affection, unearthliness of aim, and worldly wisdom which characterized his private intercourse, of his power of attracting little children and learned men, one as much as the other. Any leisure he could find at home he loved to devote to reading. Indeed, from this it was hard to separate him even when ill. For his theological reading he went to great trouble to secure great works. New lives and revelations of the saints he also avidly devoured. Furthermore, he found considerable interest in most of the publications of the day dealing with physical geography, natural science, and travel. He went rapidly through his books, but always took the trouble to note with a pencil at the end of each volume references to material he considered especially useful. Through his extensive reading, he was able to accumulate a wealth of illustrations and information for his sermons and lectures, and, above all, for his major writings, since for these he was wont to prepare several years before he undertook to compose them. Through these writings, his name became so widely known that a large number of people throughout the country eagerly sought his spiritual advice, and all their letters he scrupulously answered, oftentimes at considerable length, despite his very busy days at the oratory. These replies to letters of this type he considered a matter of strict duty. Proof of this we have from one of his priests, who, finding in his room a large pile of letters ready for the post, expressed envy of his talent for answering such spiritual inquirers. "Talent?" exclaimed Father Faber. "It's the fear of God." This appeal of his as a director of souls was far from due to prescriptions for an easy route to sanctity. He sought to make souls aim at the heights, but at the same time endeavored to make heroic striving look as fascinating as possible. As a guide of souls, in the words of Cardinal Manning, he had a thorough mistrust and dislike of all low views and compromises in serving God. He aspired for others to the highest, not out of any rigor or moroseness, nor out of any vain-glorious affectation of sanctity, but from a deep and consistent desire after the nearest union with God. No one was more large in permitting all that is innocent or lawful, none more high-minded in encouraging, inviting, urging men up the narrow path. All this work he tried to pack into a very regular mode of existence. This regularity of life, however, he had often to forsake because of violent headaches, sciatica, and eczema. But these painful interruptions of his system of life he did his utmost to use for his spiritual benefit. "As far as my will goes," he wrote at this period, "I am quite ready for the suffering. And don't doubt it is an immense love which makes God think it is worth his while to take so much pains with me. What I fear is my patience, temper, and the proper degree of unselfishness." That his will knew great victories in this matter was proved by the fact that he rarely did or said anything to reveal his sufferings. Indeed, he was often known to work while the victim of hidden pain, which would have prostrated persons physically much stronger than he. And now to return to the main current of events. In doing so, the next undertaking of Father Faber we consider worthy of record was a course of sermons he preached during the octave of Corpus Christi, 1854. These pulpit utterances were later on to provide the basis for his book on the Blessed Sacrament. At this time, too, it is of interest to note he was busy writing his book, Growth in Holiness. A little later came a well-merited papal honor in recognition of his theological ability as a speaker and writer. On July 9th, he was made a Doctor of Divinity. Before we part with the year 1854, we think it proper to give to the reader another event in his career. This was a Triduum he preached on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which happened to be the very day on which the Mystery was declared an article of faith, a declaration which, in his book on the Blessed Sacrament, he called the most glorious definition of the Catholic faith, one which the torment of cruel heresy has not wrung from the reluctant reverence of the Church, but which is the irresistible and spontaneous outburst of doctrine and devotion, too hot to be longer pent within her mighty heart. For him to do so was an occasion of great joy because of his very childlike and ardent love of Our Lady. For explicit proof of that, of joy, we have only to go to the following passage in his book on the Blessed Sacrament, referring to that occasion. "Blessed be the mercy of the Most High, who cast our lot upon these days and kept us alive to see this triumph of our Mother's honor." The first noteworthy happening of the new year in which he participated was the Second Provincial Synod of Westminster, which assembled during the summer at Oscott. To this Father Faber was paid the tribute of an invitation as a theologian. At this synod he participated very actively in the committee set up for the compilation of the Catechism, although humility prevented him from accepting appointments in other committees to which it was proposed to nominate him. Furthermore, he had the honor of preaching before this assembly. For the next important event in his life, we pass to September of the same year when he paid Lee's second visit to Ireland. A good deal of time there, however, was rendered unpleasant through serious illness. As a result of Tlia's illness, he had to abandon the pulpit for the rest of the year. Next year saw him well enough to undertake preaching during spring and summer. Referring to the sermons of that period, Cardinal Wiseman, when preaching the Pain Gyric on the feast of St. Philip, said that by them Father Faber had gathered within the gardens of the church sweet flowers of devotion for her children, and taught them, in thoughts that glow and words that burn, to prize the banquet which love has spread for their refreshment. For all these exacting days on the pulpit, Father Faber did not hesitate at this time to undertake a new work which brought him many fresh anxieties. At the request of Cardinal Wiseman, he undertook a mission to which a large portion of the surrounding district was assigned. In the early part of the next year, 1857, Father Faber took part in the conduct of an important mission at the Oratory. At its close, the Confraternity of St. Patrick, founded some years previously by himself at Holborn in honor of the Mass and the Blessed Sacrament, was solemnly established in the Oratory mission. Its members wore the blue scapular of the Immaculate Conception. Besides regular assistance at Mass and benediction, they were pledged to endeavor to bring negligent Catholics to those functions. To implement this pledge, a body of visitors was formed with courts and districts assigned to them, which they visited on Sunday mornings to exhort the people to go to Mass. That the work of this confraternity was very fruitful seems evident from the fact that it won papal approval in the form of enrichment with many indulgences. Further striking testimony to its good work we have, about a dozen years after its solemn establishment, from a letter of a missionary priest in the Weekly Register. "I found," wrote this priest, "the benefits arising from St. Patrick's confraternity more numerous and enduring than from the first mission or spiritual retreat given here by a religious order. And this is so although the mission was the first ever conducted here, and was considered most successful. From this stress of work he found relief that year in a holiday spent at Arden Capel Castle near Helensburgh, Scotland, through the kindness of Anne, Duchess of Argyll. There he enjoyed marked freedom from care amid the glories of the neighboring wild country of mountain and lake. To the same peaceful scenes he was able to return in the summer of 1858. An important event of the year 1858 was his preaching of notes during Lent dealing with the precious blood which were afterwards to appear in book form. After this course of sermons, the church was closed for 3 months to permit the making of an addition to its height. While the church was closed, he found good work to occupy him outside the oratory. In May 1858, he happened to meet Mother Margaret Mary Hallahan, who had come to London to take charge of the Hospital of St. Elizabeth in Great Ormond Street. In this enterprise, he did much to encourage and help this woman. And through this work, they got so to know and value each other that henceforth they became close and lasting friends. Speaking of the basis of this friendship, Father Bowden, Father Faber's fellow Oratorian, says, "There was a great similarity between their souls. They had the same largeness of heart and singleness of purpose, and both were engaged in works for the glory of God, which, in their respective spheres, were certainly without an equal." Father Faber delighted in Mother Margaret's bold simplicity and religious fervor, while she was in turn filled with admiration of his practical wisdom and holiness. She used to relate how one day, when she returned somewhat out of spirits from a long meeting where there had been a good deal of discussion without any tangible result, Father Faber cheered her by saying, "Don't you know, my dear mother, that there are always 99 says for one do?" The spring of 1859 saw him once again very busy in the oratory. In Lent, he preached a remarkable course of sermons on the fear of God. Other outstanding utterances of that year were 5 sermons for the novena to St. Philip Neri. The year I-860 he ushered in by taking a prominent part in the devotion of the 40 hours for the necessities of the sovereign pontiff. At the Mass of Exposition, he preached a striking sermon on devotion to the Pope. This afterwards found its way into print. In this form, it so captured the admiration of the reading public that translations of it soon appeared in French and Italian. It spoke trumpet-toned of his devotion to the Holy See, especially, as was now the case, when serious dangers menaced it. Nor was this the last of his striking acts in behalf of the Holy See. In 1861, he founded the Association of St. Peter for the purpose of praying for the Pope. Paying tribute to the loyalty thus evinced by Father Faber for the sovereign pontiff, a writer in the tablet of October 4, 1863, said, "He taught men to regard the Pope as their father and not as their king only. He could not bear to hear of rights or privileges or customs in any local church unless they had been allowed by the Holy See, for his obedience was a loyal love that knew no questioning in the presence of a father whose rights he would never measure." During the Lent of I-860, he delivered, despite very poor health, a course of lectures on Old Testament history. The notes used for this purpose were published soon after his death. The only other unusual event of his life this year was his acceptance of an invitation to Arundel Castle in October. There he remained for 8 weeks, although his own health was very poor, giving spiritual direction and solace to the dying Duke of Norfolk. Early in 1861, he was back again at the oratory. Although then his health was as feeble as during the Lent of I-860, it could not keep him from long and arduous work on the pulpit. From the end of January till early in July, he preached on almost every Sunday, as well as on the Fridays of Lent. Outstanding amongst these pulpit orations was a sermon on devotion to the Church delivered on the Feast of Pentecost. So much did this impress some of his listeners that it found its way into print on their special request. From these labors, Father Faber, still a very sick man, got a few weeks' respite during the summer at Filey. But even there, his energetic mind would not accept complete repose. In that retreat, he completed his book of hymns by writing the Nativity of Our Lady. With the arrival of autumn, his health sufficiently improved to permit him to resume work in the pulpit. On November 1st, he started with a sermon, The Octave of the Holy Souls, at the oratory. 3 days later, he preached the panegyric of St. Charles at St. Mary of the Angels, Bayswater. A week subsequently, however, he suffered a breakdown in health, which was to remove him almost completely from work till the close of his life. Chapter 12. The Preacher and Writer. As we have now reached that part of Father Faber's life in which illness compelled him to forsake almost altogether his active career as a priest, we think it opportune to halt once more our chronological order of events and devote a chapter to the consideration of 2 very important phases of his life, his work as a preacher and as a writer. Father Faber, as we have already stated, relied much on his power as a preacher for his apostolic success. For this reason, he went to great pains to become a capable and attractive dispenser of divine truth. For his ordinary sermons, even for addresses to children, he was wont to prepare by considerable note-taking, whilst for pulpit utterances for important occasions, he was accustomed to provide himself with copious material through extensive and very careful reading. Most of his preaching, however, he had to confine to the oratory partly because of ill health and partly because of pressure of work. That rich store of material, his sanctity, mastery of graceful expression, fine imaginative power, and fascinating personality, transformed into a weapon of rare effectiveness for winning souls to God. But his sanctity so dominated his natural gifts that one never felt that profound thought, rich imagery, fluent language, tone of voice, or grace of gesture ever preached anything save the message of Jesus Christ. In the words of Cardinal Manning, he had a facility and flexibility of mind and voice, a vividness of apprehension and of imagination, a beauty of conception and of expression, a beauty that is to the eye and ear, with a brightness of confidence, as of a man who lived in the light and peace of God, and a longing desire to make others possess the happiness he enjoyed. Father Faber's preaching was not a discourse elaborately worked out and delivered with a sensible or conscious effort, but the overflow of a mind perpetually fed from its own inward sources and pouring with an exuberance of which we have known no example. To this ardent desire to preach Jesus Christ and nothing else, another eminent churchman pays a tribute no less telling. Father Faber, says Dom Geringer, abbot of Solesmes, was always ready, always abundant and copious, always full of action, disclosing in every word the liveliness of his faith and the ardor of his love of God. Rising above all motives of policy and above all weakness, neither his words nor his pen were ever checked by any human consideration. He would never consent to gloss over either the absolute formulas of dogma, the severity of the moral law, or the maxims of the spiritual life. He was aware that among his numerous hearers, Protestants as well as fervent Christians thronged round him, yet the desire of obtaining the unanimous applause of so mixed an audience never extorted from him one of those compliances or one of those reserves to which it is so easy to give way. His holy pride in possessing the truth through the Church which alone on earth can give it to us forbade his accommodating it to men who can only be its humble disciples. And if he at times gave offense to certain minds, imitating in this respect the Son of God and his apostles, he attracted others who felt themselves entirely carried away by the fervor of his words and the force of his convictions. Thus was signally realized in his pulpit utterances what he feared rarely characterized sacred oratory. "How few preachers are holy men," he wrote, "and yet without unction what will their sermons be worth? Eloquence, a plague upon the word when we are talking of Jesus and of souls, has no gift or benediction. Its harvest is but the preacher's praise and the wasted time of the silly, gaping audience. But to preach Jesus Christ and him crucified, that is another thing. That such a preacher should win many souls to Christ was quite to be expected, and so it happened. Through his pulpit career, Father Faber led great numbers of lax Catholics back to God-fearing ways of life. Through it, too, he brought many hundreds of souls from the darkness of heresy to the light and peace of the Catholic Church. Yet, for all his shining gifts of mind, Father Faber tried, after the manner of St. Francis de Sales, for charity's sake to avoid, as far as possible, controversy in the pulpit. Such indeed was his dislike of this type of preaching that, whenever he felt compelled to have recourse to it, it brought him bitter pain. To quote his own words, controversy was for him a cross, a penance, an austerity worse than fasting, watching, or the harassing hair shirt. Hence it was that, too, in his sermons to Catholics, he sedulously avoided reference to Protestant prejudices. Hence, too, it was that in his lectures to Protestants during the daily evening services at the oratory, he tried, as far as possible, to convey to his separated brethren their position of error through the clear exposition of the truth and beauty of Catholic dogma. From his preaching, we now turn to a phase of his work which, more than all else, has served to make his name familiar to the Catholic world as a servant of God. This is his major spiritual writings, the circulation of which, till the present time, and the constant quotation of which by spiritual writers have raised him to the rank of a master of mystical theology. This main contribution of his to Catholic literature consisted of 8 substantial volumes published between 1853 and I-860. This was certainly a very remarkable literary accomplishment, considering the brief period of its execution, the number and variety of the author's priestly duties, and a considerable dose of ill health. During that period, the foundation and government of the oratory and the mastership of novices for 5 years were his responsibilities. Within that space of time, too, he took his turn at preaching and hearing confessions and answered calls for spiritual advice. And finally, these years he was often prostrated by very painful maladies. Behind this splendid achievement, the great power was a zeal of heroic caliber for the salvation of souls. Through this zeal, too, he had devoted years to book reading and careful taking of notes that he might meet his work of composition laden with spiritual wisdom. For his own testimony concerning his painstaking ways of preparation for his writings, we will cite an extract from his preface to his spiritual conferences. "It has been my custom," he wrote, "to have the notes of 4 of them, very full and detailed, prepared several weeks, often several months, before delivering them. They were then revised before preaching, and very often annotated immediately after preaching when necessary or desirable changes struck me in the act and fervor of delivery. There is nothing which brings out any want of logical sequence, or any disproportionate arrangement of thoughts more vividly than the act of preaching, and I have repeatedly profited by this fact. The notes were then laid aside, some for 2 years, some for 1 year, some for a few months, before I finally revised them for writing, and at last wrote them out. I have long adopted this custom with what concerned the spiritual life, so as to secure myself from putting forth mere views struck out in a heat, and also that I might convert the opinions expressed, whatever their intrinsic value might be, into judgments ascertained with care, matured by experience and revised with jealous repetition under various circumstances and in different moods of mind. And such was his spirit of work when came the time for writing these books, that many hours a day, sometimes as many as 16, saw him at his desk. This wealth of material, too, it is of interest to note, he got rapidly into ordered form. Yet, for all this speed, such was his commanding clarity of mind that rarely did he need to make corrections in his manuscripts before sending them to the printer. The first of these great works appeared in July 1853. This was All for Jesus, or The Easy Ways of Divine Love. In this book, he said he was not putting forward what is perfect, but what is easy. Its object was to assist people in the world to sanctify themselves by putting before them things which, while being attractive as devotions, tended to raise their fervor, quicken their love, and increase their happiness in practical religion and its duties. That sanctity, however, to which he believed this book could lead souls, was something far beyond the ordinary. I would venture to say, he wrote, that under spiritual direction and with honest souls, the book would lead persons to the practice of austerities. And we would further venture to say that much of it could lead souls, if not to perfection, at least to its very threshold. It met with a very widespread welcome. A large edition was sold in less than a month. 4 editions were disposed of within 9 months. In the United States, too, it met with a remarkable reception. There, its circulation surpassed that of all his succeeding works. Lands outside the English-speaking world also called for it, and as a result, versions of it appeared in French, German, Flemish, Italian, and Polish. In these countries, it was most popular in France, where 40,000 copies were sold. In addition to this popular appreciation, it extracted expressions of high approval from many distinguished ecclesiastics. A few representative samples of these we give the reader. "I am delighted with it," the Bishop of Birmingham informed him. "It rouses like a trumpet and penetrates like a fire and draws forth the soul out of that obscure cavern of self-complacency almost irresistibly, to place her on the side of God and of his divine interests." Dr. Newsham of St. Cuthbert's College, Ushaw, told him that he was so delighted with it that he would sing its praises wherever he could. Father Cardella of the Collegio Romano wrote to him saying, "Few books have I ever read with so much pleasure as this of yours." For all this chorus of approval, there were, however, not lacking some who looked askance at his efforts to make the way to heaven look so attractive, as critics long before him had assailed the fascinating manner in which St. Francis de Sales had pointed the way heavenwards. They failed to appreciate the fact that the beauty of virtue profoundly envisaged can, like the glory of an alpine height, render the toils and sufferings entailed in reaching it things of delight for athletes of the spirit. Furthermore, they made no allowance for the fact that several kinds of penance were mentioned in this work. Next came Growth in Holiness, or The Progress of the Spiritual Life, at the close of 1854. This was the second of 3 treatises on this subject which he intended to write, but which were never realized. The first of these was to be entitled First Fervors. The third was to be called The Gate of Heaven. What he said of the plan of this proposed work may be of interest to the reader. "I have made a sort of map," he said, "of the spiritual life in my own mind. I have divided it into 3 regions of very unequal extent and of very diversified interest. First there comes the region of beginnings, a wonderful time, so wonderful that nobody realizes how wonderful it is till they are out of it and can look back on it. Then stretches a vast extent of wilderness full of temptation, struggles, and fatigue, a place of work and suffering, with angels, good and bad, winging their way in every direction, the roads hard to find and slippery underfoot, and Jesus with the cross meeting us at every turn. This is 10 or 12 times the length of the first region. Then comes a region of beautiful, wooded, watered, yet rocky mountains, lovely yet savage too, liable to terrific tempests, and to those sudden overcastings of bright nature which characterize mountain districts. This last is the land of high prayer, of brave self-crucifixions, of mystical trials, of heights of superhuman detachments and abjection, whose rarefied atmosphere only chosen souls can breathe. The second of these he wrote for souls who are engaged in patient perseverance in the humbling practices of solid virtue. For them, in his own words, he tried to harmonize the ancient and modern spirituality of the Church with somewhat, perhaps, of a propension to the first, and to put it before English Catholics in an English shape, translated into native thought and feeling, as well as language. This attempt to translate foreign spirituality into English thought, feeling, and language, it is of interest to note, was a marked departure from the spiritual outlook of his early, inexperienced days as a Catholic, when he felt that things peculiar to foreign piety should meet with a sympathetic reception from co-religionists of his own land. After a preliminary statement of the condition of the souls for whom he wrote Growth in Holiness, he discusses their dangers, the precautions they should take, and the practices they should adopt to secure their well-being. The chapters on the abiding sorrow for sin, prayer, temptations, scruples, and the office of the spiritual director have been considered by those versed in devotional reading the most interesting and valuable in the book. Furthermore, this is one of the works in which he displays most of that practical wisdom born of his profound knowledge of the human heart. After this appeared in 1855, The Blessed Sacrament, or The Works and Ways of God. This, in his own words, was written to popularize certain portions of the science of theology in the same way as handbooks and manuals have popularized astronomy, geology, and other physical sciences. In its 4 books, it deals respectively with the Blessed Sacrament as the greatest work of God, the devotion of Catholics, a picture of God, and a picture of Jesus. In learning and research, it is outstanding amongst his works. Furthermore, many of the most sublime and beautiful passages which ever came from his pen appear on its pages. It was well received by the reading public, seeing that its first edition of 2,000 copies disappeared in a very short time. This was followed towards the end of 1856 by The Creator and the Creature. This work, the author informs us, stands to his other works in the relation of source and origin. It has been this view of God, pondered for years, that has given rise to the theological bias visible in the other books, as well as to the opinions expressed on the spiritual life. Difficulties which may have been found in the other books respecting the sacred humanity, the Blessed Sacrament, Our Lady, purgatory, indulgences, and the like will, for the most part, find their explanation here. For this treatise explains in detail the point of view from which the author habitually looks at all religious questions, of practice as well as of speculation. It was written primarily, the author tells us, because of his belief that the ruling spirit of the age is rather a forgetfulness that we are creatures than a forgetfulness of the Creator, that many more persons are infected with this evil than have any suspicion of it, that it lies at the bottom of all the objections men make to the doctrines of spirituality, and furthermore, that many more persons would serve God, would frequent the sacraments, avoid sin, and be ordinarily good Catholics if they had a clear view of the relations between themselves and God as creature and creator. This work he divided into 3 parts. The first contains a description of the phenomena around us, a detailed account of what it is to have a creator and of what follows from our being his creatures. It also contains the result of this inquiry, namely, The finding, he tells us, that creation is simply an act of divine love. The second part is occupied with the difficulties and depths of this love. The third part begins by answering questions started in the course of this inquiry and concludes with an account of the nature, power, and prevalence of worldliness, the only escape from which is personal love of the Creator, a religion which is simply a service of love, a love which brings us within the suck of that gulf of the divine beauty, which is our holiness here, as it is our happiness hereafter. This book cost him immense labor. Speaking of the preparatory work it meant for him, he says, "The best theologians have been collated even to weariness, and if the book had been allowed to exhibit in notes or appendices the labor which it has entailed, it would have swollen to an inconvenient bulk." Next came before the Lent of 1858, The Foot of the Cross, or The Sorrows of Mary. This was the only one of a series of works on the Passion planned to be written which he was able to publish. It contains a minute account and analysis of each of Our Lady's dollars, her martyrdom in them, their fountains and characteristics, the spirit and devotion with which they should be regarded, and a comparison between her compassion and the passion of her Son. This is one of the works which most abounds in practical wisdom for the guidance of souls. This book got a splendid reception from the reviewers, and even some years after its publication, the Civiltà Cattolica of the Jesuits did not hesitate to proclaim it one of the best books ever published on the Dolors of Mary. After this, he sent to the printers early in 1859, Spiritual Conferences. This work is considered well representative of the average type of sermon he was wont to preach. It is replete with his characteristic excellences as a spiritual thinker and writer. Of these, one of the most fascinating, perhaps, is its wealth of short, epigrammatic sentences packed with practical wisdom. This was followed in the Lent of I-860 by The Precious Blood, or The Price of Our Salvation. It was written for and dedicated to the Confraternity of the Precious Blood at the Oratory. The undertaking of this work was doubtless very considerably due to his great personal devotion to the precious blood. For this devotion, he had a long-standing preference because, as he tells us, it was precisely the precious blood, and nothing but the precious blood, which was the chosen instrument of our redemption. It is this singular reality, this unmated office, this unshared privilege, in which the grandeur of the precious blood resides, a grandeur which is also communicated to the devotion. The mysterious fact that the blood was the chosen price of man's redemption confers a distinctive majesty upon the precious blood in which our Lord's body and his soul only participate concomitantly. Furthermore, he liked it because of its being the characteristic devotion of the time and because it was a special worship of the sacred humanity. The book begins with reflections on the mystery of the precious blood. After that, he strives to arrive at a right estimate of the precious blood by studying our extreme need of it and our immeasurable wretchedness without it. Then conies an expose of its character through the method of its government and an estimate of its magnificence through the splendor of its dominion. This is followed by an unfolding of its chronicles or history. Subsequently, we have its biography, which especially reveals its prodigality. The work he brings to a conclusion with its characteristics and the spirit of devotion to it. The last great work, Bethlehem, was published during the advent of I-860. This, he was wont to say, he wrote to please himself. It was a treatise on the mysteries of the sacred infancy. How he decided to treat these mysteries, the following passage from the prefatory epistle of this work reveals to us. There are several ways, he wrote, in which we may treat of the mysteries of the 33 years of our dearest Lord. We may look at each of them singly as it is in itself, full of grace and beauty, and distinctively unlike any other. Secondly, we may gather them up into departments and call them the joyful, the sorrowful, and the glorious mysteries, the three sets differing thus from each other, and in the unity of each set, each mystery having its own distinctness. Or thirdly, we may view them as clustering in constellations, and yet these constellations' unities as the childhood, the hidden life, the Pub HC ministry, the passion, and the risen life, or great 40 days. Each of these constellations has a more perfect unity than the divisions of mysteries according to their joyous, sorrowful, or glorious character, while at the same time the single mysteries, which compose the unities, have also a greater variety. Fourthly, we have much to learn by putting out of view the separate mysteries and studying the contrasts and comparisons of those 5 constellations one with another. It is hard to say whether their analogies or diversities are the most full of theology and devotion. The following treatise is a specimen of the third method of considering the 33 years, united where it was naturally suggested with the fourth. For its wealth of poetic conceptions and sustained beauty of diction, it bids fair to surpass all his other major works. In all these works, although they were written primarily for devotional purposes, the theological scholar of profound and wide erudition stands revealed. For theological erudition in books of this kind, he saw justification in the close connection between dogmatic and devotional treatises concerning the things of God. There is a close connection between devotion and theology, he wrote. The devotions of one age become the dogmas of another, as in the case of the Immaculate Conception, and the dogmas of one age become devotions in others, as it was with the mysteries of the Sacred Humanity and the Maternity of Mary. Thus, time goes on commuting dogma into devotion and devotion into dogma by a double process continually. There is no icty in devotion if it be separated from dogma, though it may sometimes go before and sometimes follow after. Furthermore, for this theological learning in devotional works he saw an especial need in his day, the present. Times, he wrote, render this study more important than ever. Intellectual activity is the order of the day, reasons must be had for everything, and doctrine must show itself. Equal to the philosophical and scientific developments of the age, this wealth of erudition is, however, rendered pleasant and light by a striking clarity of thought couched in the familiar, ardent, and colorful language of the preacher. If occasionally this language becomes somewhat extravagant, we feel well justified in excusing it, as Newman did to a Protestant critic in a man so charged with poetic feeling. In these works, too, there is a rich store of mystical theology. Much of the mastery in this sphere he derived from his wide and careful reading of the lives of the saints. To complete our tribute to Father Faber, the prose writer, we can do nothing more fitting than to give our readers the estimate formed of him by the great scholar and spiritual writer Dom Proper Garanger, Abbot of Solesmes. Father Faber, he said, united in himself many of those qualifications which make up the true spiritual writer: holiness of life, knowledge of divine things, and experience of the operations of grace, both in himself and in others. A sound theology enabled him to speak worthily of its mysteries. A faith scrupulously orthodox guided his mind in safety through the rocks with which his path was strewn. A profound and well-reasoned study of ascetical and mystical books of every school directed his course rightly in a world which is far above the world of nature. An intimate acquaintance with the lives of the saints revealed to him the secrets of grace, and a complete humility accompanied him during his whole career as a spiritual writer. There is not a page of Father Faber, whether it be severe or sparkling, in which we do not discover the saint, the man who never wrote a single line to put forward or recommend himself. Prose was not the only product of Father Faber's pen which brought him international repute. He was also a great hymnologist. The first few of his hymns appeared in print in 1848 for the use of the congregation at St. Wilfrid's. To these many more were added in a volume entitled Jesus and Mary, which appeared in 1849. To these still more were added in the collection known as the Oratory Hymns. His final collection of hymns, 150 in number to correspond with the Psalter, was published in 1862. Although his first hymns seem too theological and scholastic, the main portion of his work nicely blends theological accuracy with fervent devotion, musical rhythm, and considerable poetic talent. Of their devotional appeal, we have undeniable evidence in the fact that even these present times, many of them are highly favored throughout the English-speaking Catholic world. Furthermore, many of them found their way into Protestant collections. Thus did Father Faber, in fascinating and fruitful fashion, fulfill his resolution to consecrate his most mature poetic days to the writing of sacred songs. And finally, a brief discussion of the little body of poetry he took the trouble to produce. A collected edition of his poems was published in 1857. Although this contained plenty of affectionate and religious feeling, very rarely was there to be found in it anything suggestive of high-class poetry. An occasional sonnet, however, could bear comparison with the poems of those considered the best poets of his day. In most of his poems, Wordsworth seems clearly to be his master and model. His having failed to attain to a much higher level in poetic creations seems likely due to the fact that the religious urge in him led him to abandon the writing of poetry before he had taken more than a dilettante interest in it. Of this his friend, Wordsworth, was convinced because he said, if it was not for Frederick Faber's devoting himself so much to his sacred calling, he would be the poet of his age. Chapter 13. Last Days and Death. As we stated at the close of Chapter 11, towards the middle of November 1861, there came to Father Faber the illness which was to make him an invalid for the rest of his life and remove him for the most part from active service. The occasion of this sickness was his departure on November 9th for Arundel Castle to attend there Canon Tierney, who was dying. A little later, after his arrival at the castle, he was violently attacked by bronchitis. This was followed by inflammation of the lungs and signs of heart trouble. For all this suffering, he managed to see everyday proof sheets of a new edition of his hymns. This, too, he did, whilst concealing his trouble beneath a remarkable calmness of disposition, and sometimes even under a cloak of good humor. When, for instance, his friend Lady Howard, who assisted him in the revision of these hymns, informed him that she was surprised that he could write such beautiful verses in the midst of so much suffering, his reply was that swans sing most sweetly before they die. Of the exemplary patience which he evinced during this illness, we have striking testimony from the pen of Reverend F. Ballston, who had been sent to him from London as infirmarian. The father, he wrote, must look forward to a life of suffering. He is not in the least dismayed about this. He says he has felt for 2 years that his heart was wrong, and that he does not feel the least desire that tilings should be otherwise. He says that if God does not choose to take him now, and he says that he knows well enough that he is not fit for it, he is most willing that God should punish him for 20 years, if he will only give him the grace of final perseverance. He says God has been wonderfully good to him this illness. He was quite peevishly fretful to get home whilst it was coming on. But from the hour when he was actually prostrate, he is not aware that he had had even the slightest temptation to murmur or be impatient. And to his surprise, he cannot feel the least desire that any of his sufferings should be less. The one he has felt hardest to bear has been the complete prostration with the inability to lie down. But even this has given him a joyous devotion to the posture of Jesus on the cross. At the same time, he begs us to remember that he is in the midst of a ducal palace with stacks of down pillows all about him, his own people to nurse him, all the servants literally making a joy of sitting up with him and taking all kinds of trouble. Even the very children of the house having independent services for him in the room where their father died, and the Duchess determined he shall be healed in the best possible way. So as he observes, there is not much likeness between him and Jesus on the cross. From this illness he recovered sufficiently to return to London for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. As his recovery, however, was far from complete, his fathers requested him to refrain from preaching that year. With this request he complied, but he remained at Brompton, directing as usual all the work of the congregation. The next year, 1862, found him for the most part so ill that he could scarcely do any work. Oftentimes during that year, such was the severity of the pain which visited him that he found all prayer save ejaculations difficult. How ardently he desired to remain prayerful despite his sufferings we can see in the following letter of October 10th, 1862, to his brother, Reverend F. A. Faber. I suppose pain is always a precious gift of God and the greatest of all assimilations to our dear and blessed Lord. Yet I find in my own case the melancholy truth of Thomas A. Kempis, Pauci ex infirmitate, meliorantur. Pain does not altogether dispense either from penance or from prayer, and yet it is hard either to do penance or to pray in illness. Ejaculations about the passion and mental acts of conformity to God's will do me most good. Only one wants them to be continuous, and one would like them to be hot. However, this last quality is not necessary to their acceptableness. One feels it is most compassionate of God to let us have our purgatory on this side of the grave. Still, in sufferings here one may fall from God by sin, by impatience and the like, whereas in purgatory, as the tree falls, so must it lie. Increased sweetness to others, increased thoughtfulness and legislation for the tiny comforts of others, and a snubbing of the body's inventive appetite for lots of little tilings and little extras, not absolutely wanted. These are what I set before myself in illness, and then how little way I have the pluck to go at least makes me a trifle more humble and self-hating, and so there is some good done. The preaching he was compelled to abandon for a year he sought to resume at the approach of Lent, 1863. A little of this his doctor allowed him to do on condition that on such occasions another priest should be at hand with sermons in case Father Faber might not feel fit for his work. Thus conditioned, he was able to occupy the pulpit for 5 Sundays. Soon, however, after Easter of 1863, his sufferings became much more serious. It was discovered that he had Bright's disease in an advanced stage. At first it was hoped that its progress might be checked, but the expectation quickly proved delusive, and Father Faber himself felt that the end was not far off. In a letter to Father Bowden, dated April 23, 1863, he said, "It has come to me to feel not sure of my recovery now. I am more ill than is thought, but all is in God's hands. I do not see how I can recover now. If the feeling lasts, the community must not ask me to be away." From this trouble he sought some relief during April in 2 or 3 short visits to Southend. These trips brought him but little alleviation of his trouble. As a result, April 26, 1863, was the last occasion on which he was able to offer the holy sacrifice. As the news of his worsened condition became noised abroad, inquiries and expressions of sympathy began to pour in from every side. Prayers, communions, and masses were offered up that he might yet be spared to his community and his people. In the meantime, however, he grew rapidly worse. On June 16th, he received the last sacraments. Holy Viaticum he received with great fervor, as dressed in his habit he sat in an armchair. After that, as the fathers were leaving his room, he repeated a few times, "Thank you all." Then, turning to his attendant, he said, "Ah, John, it's a grand thing to die a Christian." Then came a short pause and the words, "I have nothing to forgive anybody for, nothing against a single member of the community. I would give my life for any one of them." These dangerous symptoms developed so rapidly during the latter part of June that his doctors thought the end was imminent. He himself, knowing that his condition was extremely serious, saw every member of his community one by one on June 28th and recommended himself to their prayers. Furthermore, as this was his birthday, he gave a parting gift to every member of his community. To one of the fathers, it is recorded that he spoke as follows, "God has been so good and arranged it all so well. This is my birthday, and the doctor says I am going fast. And probably without pain. No, not without pain, for that is impossible, but with as little pain as possible. I wish to die stripped of everything. One thing we must all go on doing. Pray that I may save my soul." In the midst of these final trials, he had the consolation of a visit on July 14th from Cardinal Wiseman. That visit was very brief because of the cardinal's wish not to tire him. However, on his return home, he wrote to him, extolling at length his apostolic career and stressing his life work as a great consoling factor when death was approaching. Here is the letter in its entirety. "My dear Father Faber, there were many things which I desired to say to you this afternoon, but which I did not say, so I must write some of them. I cannot but think how consoled and fortified you must now feel by your having, from the moment of your joining the church, so entirely devoted your time and abilities to the particular and almost exclusive work of promoting and extending in it the spirit of holiness and of true piety. And your exertions have been eminently blessed not only in England, but in every country, as the Holy Father himself declared to me. Thousands must now be praying to God to return to you the blessings you have been the cause of to them. If I may use the expression, you have put under contribution every treasure of God's grace in your own favor. Mary's joys and sorrows, Bethlehem and Calvary, our Lord's sacred passion, the most adorable Eucharist, and his whole self. Surely the hour has come for the reward of all this, or rather, for the fullest return from the love of Jesus and Mary to their faithful and devoted servant. I cannot doubt that it is so, though it is natural for him to look at the other side of the account and think of his debts rather than of the accumulated claims which he has been erecting to divine clemency, indulgence, and liberality. There can be no danger in dwelling on the mercies rather than on the justice of God, and therefore none in making the best of our claims upon the former, so to disarm the latter. If one has for years been endeavoring to cleave to the cross and to cling to the hem of Mary's garment, it is the office of hope to plead these affectionate occupations of a life in favor of mercy, grace, and confidence at the approach of death. I only wish that I could look forward to similar motives and rights when, in the same crisis, the sense of such heavy responsibilities, so little answered, will weigh on me. I will not dwell on the great work which you have founded, and which will remain, not long but forever, to perpetuate the good you have done while living. It is not the mere edifice, however great, of the oratory which will do this, but the spirit of St. Philip which you have brought into London, and which will ever continue alive and active in his children. To have founded such a work as this ought much to comfort you, and fill you with peace and even joy. Indeed, this spiritual cheerfulness and humble confidence is so completely the spirit of St. Philip that your hour of suffering and anxiety is not so much its truest test as it is its very natural and native element. As the beautiful phosphorescence of the sea can only be seen in agitated waters, your good Father will be near you in this your trial, never indeed possibly more so, and with him those many saints and servants of God whom you have made known, reverenced, and invoked by so many in this country. And if my sincere affection expressed to God and his blessed Mother, in fervent prayer, and my poor blessing, can add a further drop to the abundance of better and holier consolations, you have them fully and cordially, daily repeated. Ora pro me. Henceforth he grew steadily weaker, till towards the end of July it was thought he would not last more than a few weeks. By that time, however, his fear of death had disappeared, although he said he would have preferred it to have remained. That this preference for this fear was rooted in a profound humility seems clear from a passage from one of his well-known works. This absence of the fear of death, he wrote, is extremely undesirable and greatly to be suspected. This fearlessness can only be safe when it belongs to great heights of sanctity. We should pray hard not to be of those who do not fear death. During August he lingered on with little change in his condition. The month of September, however, saw him much weaker and the victim of frequent attacks of delirium. Still, he was not too weak to keep receiving Holy Communion daily till September 24th. On September 25th, he changed so much for the worse that he had to be put to bed. To this he had not found it necessary to submit since June. There, supported by pillows, he never spoke, but gazed steadily at a large crucifix placed before him. With the approach of evening, it was quite clear that death was coming. When informed of this, his only words were, "God be praised." For all these days of great pain, he was sufficiently forgetful of self to display much interest in community affairs. Until within a week or so of his death, he often spoke freely with the fathers about their business. Sometimes he even dictated letters bearing on these matters. During these days, too, he received the visits of a number of friends. With many of these, who had not seen him for years, he rejoiced to have the opportunity of renewing old ties of friendship. Amongst those whom he was very pleased to see was Father Newman, who came from Birmingham to bid him farewell. At most times during the last months of his illness, his patience was most edifying. If at any time he became irritable through pain, he was wont to send for one of the fathers to give him absolution. Furthermore, this edifying spirit he did his utmost to sustain by prayer, especially the prayers of Saint Gertrude, a work which he had been in the habit of eising and recommending to others. The morning of September 26th found him breathing heavily with his eyes closed, or when open fixed upon a crucifix. Just after 7 came a sudden change. Then turning his head a little and giving a few spasmodic gasps, his soul went to the Lord. During those last moments his eyes opened brightly and intelligently, but with a touching expression half of sweetness and half of surprise. It seemed the realization of the picture he had once drawn. Only serve Jesus out of love, and while your eyes are yet unclosed, before the whiteness of death is yet settled upon your face, or those around you are sure that that last gentle breathing was, indeed, your last. What an unspeakable prize will you have had at the judgment seat of your dearest love, while the songs of heaven are breaking on your ears, and the glory of God is dawning on your eyes, to fade away no more forever.